Chapter 802. The commander of Gaoyang village knelt on the ground and kowtowed repeatedly. He didn't know what to say at all, because he really didn't know anything. An impatient expression appeared on the Prince of Zhongshan's face as he waved his hand to drive out the commander of Gaoyang village. The hall fell into silence again, and no one spoke for a long time. The palace had never given a clear decree, which meant that the venerable Taoist Shang Xingzhou had no bias in choosing the divine general of the Mount Song army, leaving it up to the various factions of the court to fight over it. The princes naturally wanted this position. It was said that even the Prince of Xiang, who had been in seclusion for more than a year in order to break into the divine domain, had made an exception and spoken. The Tianhai family was currently in a rather awkward situation. Although they had tried very hard to stabilize their position through their relationship with His Majesty, they could not go too far in order to avoid incurring the displeasure of the venerable Lord Taishian. Seeing that they were gradually being oppressed in the court, they could not let go of this opportunity. Everyone wanted to fight for this position, and no one wanted to be the first to speak. Moreover, what made them feel somewhat uneasy was that the Tang's 17th master had clearly died in the snowy mountains. So why had no one from the Tang clan come this time? If the Tang clan wanted to use this matter to cause trouble for the position of commander of the Mount Song army headquarters, given the relationship between the Tang clan and the palace, none of the people present had the confidence to contend against them. There are some things that everyone is well aware of, but we still have to go through the necessary procedures. The imperial court still needs to maintain its image. The impatience on Zhong Wangshan's face grew stronger and stronger. Ignoring the crowd, he signaled for the deputy of the Supreme Court to continue the trial. The deputy of the Supreme Court glanced at the dossier and was suddenly surprised. There were still people alive that night. Everyone in the hall was rather surprised at these words. Didn't the demon lord kill everyone? The Prince of Zhongshan was also interested, asking, why was it never mentioned before? The deputy of the Supreme Court read the file again and confirmed that he didn't read it wrong. He explained in a low voice. According to those two, they were affected by the battle and fainted. They only woke up a few days ago and crossed the mountains to return, so no one knows that they are still alive. The Prince of Zhongshan arched his brows and said, Interesting, bring him in for questioning. A moment later, a woman wearing the ceremonial robes of the 13 divisions of Radiant Green and a middle-aged man wearing a military uniform arrived. They were in Hua and Chen Chou, who had returned to the Mount Song Army headquarters from Sloping Cliff Horse Farm. State your identity. The teacher of the 13 divisions of Radiant Green and Hua, Deputy General Chen Chou of the Mount Song Army headquarters. Hearing these two sentences, it was obvious that the atmosphere in the main hall became more relaxed. To these powerful figures, a minor deputy general was truly not worth mentioning. Perhaps because of her relationship with the Li Palace, dealing with Hua might be somewhat more troublesome, but it was not a major issue. In short, it was fine as long as it was not someone they could not control that they did not want to see. Tell me what you saw that night. Tell me honestly and honestly. Don't lie. The Prince of Zhongshan impassively said to them. In the records, the two of you should have been dead, but now you've returned alive. If there's a problem with the fact that the two of you survived, then this prince does not mind having the two of you die again. Seeing the cold gazes of these important figures, Chen Chou felt like he had returned to that cold night when he was surrounded by the demon wolf cavalry. He knew very well that what he was about to say would offend these important figures. It could even be said that he would offend the entire imperial court. But since he had promised the other party, he had to do it, because he was a soldier of the great Zhou dynasty. He took a deep breath and was about to step forward to reply. However, someone was faster than him, and Hua stood in front of him. Looking at the Prince of Zhongshan, Tianhai Qingwen, and the other important figures, she said, in the autumn of the 3rd year of the new empire, General Chen Chou and I took a young array master on the verge of death to Gaoyang village. We received a message saying that the master of the cinnabar pill might be there. Her voice was very calm, very clear, and very unhurried. She spoke from Songyang to the lake garden being surrounded. The events of that night had only just begun, but a conclusion could already be drawn. Zhu Yi, Ning Shiwei, and Tianhai Zhani died because they wanted to plot against the master of the cinnabar pill and seize the cinnabar pill. But to their surprise, the demon lord did not die. In order to heal his injuries, he also came to the snowy mountains to search for the master of the cinnabar pill. The two sides met, so they all died. The important figures present all knew that Zhu Yi and the others truly had died to the demon lord's hands. This information came from the investigation of the scene, and most importantly from Bi Yanghong's judgment, but it could not be said to be accurate, because everyone was dead. Some of the important figures had guessed at why Zhu Yi and the others had gone to the snowy mountains, but this was the first time they had heard someone who had personally experienced it prove this point. It really was for the cinnabar pill. The Prince of Zhongshan glanced at Divine General Cheng Tao. Divine General Cheng Tao imperceptibly gave a slight nod. The Prince of Zhongshan's expression chilled as he confirmed that this was the matter the two sides had discussed in their letters last time. All the important figures of the capital knew of the cinnabar pill and had all tried to take this mystical pill for themselves. Putting aside whether what you say is true or not, even if this is the case, you cannot throw dirty water on the dead. What is murder? What is a futile attempt to seize it? A low voice rang out. The one who spoke was Tianhai Chengwen. Tianhai Zhani was his son, so he naturally could not allow his son to bear this sort of stain after his death. If they wanted to obtain the position of Divine General of the Mount Song Army, they could not leave behind anything that could easily be criticized. The important figures quickly reacted. Whether it was Tianhai Zhani, Zhu Yi, or Ning Shiwei, they could heroically die in battle. They could fall to their death from the mountain path, but they could not die like this. Divine General Jianxi expressionlessly replied, "Correct. Divine General Ning Shiwei was carrying out an order. He cannot be criticized." Impatience once more appeared on the Prince of Zhongshan's face. With a wave of his hand, he asked, "Get to the point. Did you personally witness them being killed by the demon lord?" And Hua shook her head. "We were in the garden by the lake at the time and did not see it with our own eyes, but we heard the demon lord personally admit to it. Even though the legendary demon lord was confirmed to be dead, none of the important figures present had the courage to accuse him of lying." The Prince of Zhongshan continued, "Based on what you say, the master of the cinnabar pill was also present?" And Hua calmly replied, "Yes." The Prince of Zhongshan stared into her eyes and asked, "Then how did he die?" Upon hearing this question, a few people slightly leaned forward, paying particular attention. In their view, since the demon lord had appeared, that person was assuredly dead. What they wanted to know was where the recipe for the cinnabar pill was, and Hua replied, "He did not die." The Prince of Zhongshan arched his brows. "What did you say?" And Hua calmly met his gaze and replied, "He did not die." The Prince of Zhongshan harshly yelled, "Everyone is dead, but you are still alive. That person is still alive. Do you think this prince is an idiot?" Chapter 803. The entire world knew that when the Prince of Zhongshan was expelled from the capital, he had relied on eating shit and feigning madness to avoid being sentenced to death by the Divine Empress. He had an abnormally irascible temper and would often kill at the slightest disagreement. In the past, and Hua, no matter how tranquil her Tao heart was, would inevitably feel a little uneasy in front of this mad prince's gaze, but not now. Because at a very close distance, she had felt the Pope's chest as vast as the sea of stars, his warmth like sunlight. The Pope's will had always been with her, like the sacred light. So how could she be afraid? She calmly gazed at the Prince of Zhongshan, clearly not intending to change her story. "Since that person is still alive, why did he not come with all of you?" The official from the Grand Court of Revision slightly frowned as he looked at her and said, "The murder of a divine general is a major case. Putting aside the fact that he is also a suspect, even if he wanted to testify, he should still be here." When they confirmed that the master of the cinnabar pill was dead, what they wanted the most was the recipe for the cinnabar pill. But now that they had confirmed that the person was not dead, his person was naturally more important than the recipe. And Hua replied, "Because he had important matters to attend to, he could not come here." He specifically wrote a letter describing what happened that night. Just when she was prepared to take out the letter, Divine General Chung Tao's stern voice came from the hall. How audacious! To dare use a letter to deceive all the lords present here. You must know that this is a major case, and your highness has personally come as an imperial envoy. Just who is this person? Does he dare to defy an imperial decree? And Hua's expression did not change as she calmly replied, even if your highness really did take out an imperial decree, it would be meaningless. As she said this, her gaze fell on the Prince of Zhongshan. The hall burst into an uproar, and then there was laughter. Everyone treated her words as a joke. But the Prince of Zhongshan did not laugh, even though Hua's words were directed at him, even though he really did carry an imperial decree. There was also one person who did not laugh, Tianhai Qinwen. The assassination in the snowy mountains that night had been a scheme of the capital's imperial palace and the Tang clan. It had fallen into the hands of that young array master, and the person they wanted to find and kill was Chun Changshan. This assassination plot was extremely secretive. Not even the Prince of Zhongshan and Tianhai Qinwen knew of it, but they had extremely high statuses and had managed to find out some information. It was just that they had not been able to confirm it to this day. When they saw Hua's calm expression, they could not help but feel a little surprised, thinking, could it really be like this? The Chancellor of the Grand Court of Revision mocked Hua. Based on your meaning, could that person be His Holiness the Pope? Not bad. And Hua took out the letter and looked at the important figures in the hall. This is a letter personally written by His Holiness the Pope. Which lord will come to receive it? What? A personal letter from the Pope? That person was the Pope? The Supreme Court Chancellor thought he had misheard. After a moment, he came to his senses and almost fainted. The others weren't any better. They sat in their chairs like statues, unable to move or make a sound. A moment ago, the entire hall was in an uproar. Now, the entire hall was silent, and the hall became abnormally quiet. The incomparably long silence made everyone feel incomparably depressed. Everyone looked at each other, their eyes filled with shock. After an unknown amount of time, someone finally spoke. Tianhai Qinwen's voice was still very low, but if one listened carefully, they would probably be able to detect a faintly discernible meaning. You're saying that the cinnabar pill was refined by His Holiness the Pope? And Hua replied, correct. Tianhai Qinwen asked no more questions. He seemed to casually glance at the Chancellor of the Grand Court of Revision. These important figures were accustomed to the ups and downs of officialdom, to life and death in the imperial court. They were all experienced and far-sighted individuals, so they very quickly reacted. The Chancellor of the Grand Court of Revision slapped the table and stared into Hua's eyes. He coldly said, truly absurd. His Holiness, the Pope, is the master of the Li Palace, shouldering the hopes of the millions of believers of the Orthodoxy. His benevolence and righteousness are matchless. If the cinnabar pill really did come from His Holiness the Pope, His Holiness would assuredly have given the recipe to the Orthodoxy or the imperial court a long time ago for mass production. How could His Holiness disregard the wretched state of the dying soldiers on the front lines and only provide one bottle every month? He is a scoundrel who deceives the world and uses treasures to threaten the imperial court. Upon hearing these words, Divine General Chung Tao, who had been alarmed by his rudely insulting His Holiness the Pope, felt much more at ease. The others also felt the same. The situation of the trial in the army headquarters was constantly being transmitted to the crowd on the street. Upon hearing this news, the crowd instantly fell into an uproar of shock. It turned out that the mystical cinnabar pill had been personally refined by His Holiness the Pope. The crowd surged to the gate of the army headquarters, blocking the street as they yelled. But when the Chancellor of the Court of Revision's questions were transmitted from the headquarters, the street suddenly fell silent. The Chancellor's words were very sinister. If Hua insisted that the cinnabar pill had been personally refined by His Holiness the Pope, how could this question be explained? In the years since the appearance of the cinnabar pill, many people, especially those who did not have the chance to obtain the cinnabar pill and could only watch as their comrades, companions, and loved ones died, had asked the same question. Since the cinnabar pill could regrow bones and revive the dead, why Why was that person not willing to refine more? At this moment, the long street was quiet. Countless people looked in the direction of the army headquarters, also wanting to know the answer. Benevolent Holiness the Pope, how could you bear to see so many people die? In the past, I thought the same as my lord and the people outside the headquarters. I was very confused, even angry about this question. And Hua looked at the chancellor and said, "But not anymore, because I know that there is an extremely rare ingredient in the cinnabar pill that only His Holiness the Pope can provide. Thus, whether the recipe is provided to the Li Palace or the imperial court is meaningless. Moreover, we can only successfully refine so many every month." The Prince of Zhongshan narrowed his eyes at these words, a deeper meaning hidden within them. Tianhai Qinwen also maintained his silence. The chancellor, however, did not think of anything. With a sneer, he said, "This official truly wishes to know just what sort of ingredient in the world is so rare that it cannot be found in the 100-her garden or the dallying forest. It is so rare that only His Holiness the Pope can find it." Logically speaking, there was nothing wrong with his words, and they could stand up to any scrutiny. But he quickly realized that he had once more committed an unforgivable mistake, because Hua had begun to answer. Because that ingredient is His Holiness the Pope's sacred blood. An expression of pride and glory appeared on her face as her bright voice resounded both inside and outside the army headquarters, falling into the ears of countless people. In order to save all living beings, His Holiness did not hesitate to consume his lifespan and transform his sacred blood into medicine. This is the cinnabar pill. Whether it was in the Mount Song Army headquarters or on the streets outside, countless gasps and gasps of shock could be heard. And then all sound vanished. The streets and the army headquarters were quiet. For a very long time, no one spoke. And Hua's gaze flitted across the faces of the chancellor and the other important figures. She asked, "Now, does everyone else have any questions?" Still no one spoke. The Prince of Zhongshan and Tianhai Qinwen glanced at each other, seeing the shock and wariness in each other's eyes. Chapter 804. The Prince of Zhongshan and Tianhai Qinwen were the two people with the highest status present today, so they knew the most inside information. They had even faintly heard that someone in Gaoyang village had seen a black dragon that night, but for some extremely complicated reasons, they did not believe it. It was only now that they confirmed that the master of the cinnabar pill really was Chen Changsheng. Now that they thought about it, someone had naturally concealed the true circumstances of that night, or perhaps misled them. In the entire world, who could simultaneously deceive the princes of the Chen clan and the Tianhai clan? It was naturally the venerable master of the Taoist, Shang Xingzhou, residing deep in the palace. As it turned out, Shang Xingzhou had set up a killing trap for a student that night. Zhu Yi, Ning Shiwei, and the others were just blades, just a few pitiful blades of grass by a surging flood. But probably not even Shang Xingzhou had expected that his good student had not died. Since Qin Changsheng had not died, many people would die. Even if Zhu Yi, Ning Shiwei, and the others were already dead, they would probably die again, let alone those who were still alive. The official from the Grand Court of Revision had an extremely nasty expression. He walked up to Hua and took the letter with both hands, his voice trembling as he asked, "Does Your Holiness the Pope have any orders?" And Hua replied, "In the letter, His Holiness the Pope says that Zhu Yi, Ning Shiwei, and the others are conspirators. The specific crimes are to be dealt with by the imperial court." The official breathed a sigh of relief at these words. He thought to himself, it's still a little easier to deal with people who are already dead. And Hua continued, "His Holiness also wants me to ask how the army selects talents. She was only an ordinary teacher of the 13 divisions of Radiant Green, but she was asking questions on behalf of the Pope. Divine Generals Cheng Tao and Jian, she came from the two most important armies of the Great Zhou and could be said to represent the Great Zhou army. So this question was naturally directed at them. Cheng Tao and Jian, she did not dare to sit still. They stood up, slightly lowered their heads, and silently and respectfully listened. And Hua turned her gaze to the other important personages. Tianhai Chunwan gave a self-deprecating laugh as he used his hands to support himself on the armrests of his chair and slowly stood up. He seemed particularly exhausted. The Prince of Zhongshan was an imperial envoy and had an imperial decree on him, so he did not need to stand. However, his expression was still rather solemn. His Holiness said that he is very disappointed of the current Great Zhou. Anhua's voice was still very calm. From a northern frontier to the imperial court, from the divine generals to the noble clans, it is all rotten to the core. His words were forceful and high-pitched. If it had been an ordinary citizen, these words would have been a complaint, but the one saying these words was the Pope, so they naturally carried a completely different meaning. The Prince of Zhongshan and Tianhai Chunwan once more stared at each other, the wariness in their eyes growing thicker and thicker. The Pope naturally had the right to say these words, and he could even rain down curses on everyone except the Emperor, but this matter involved politics. Other than venting his emotions, what meaning did this have? In their view, although the Pope was young, he still should not have done such a meaningless thing. There was assuredly a follow-up. Just as expected, Anhua changed the topic and said, "Only the former commander of 7 Lishi's roaming cavalry, Chen Shou." Chen Shou said nothing this entire time. He was very nervous. As he watched Anhua calmly speak in front of these important figures, he felt a deep sense of admiration. He did not expect that he would be mentioned so soon. Although he had mentally prepared himself, he still felt like his mind was buzzing, and then he could no longer hear what Anhua was saying. Outstanding military service? All right. He had indeed made a lot of contributions when he was with that fellow at 7 Lishi, but wasn't all suppressed by the military headquarters? Loving soldiers like their own children? Undressing them and pushing them to eat them? All right. Although I truly do get along well with my subordinates, how could I let them have wine and meat? Extremely virtuous? All right. I truly did not hesitate to violate military discipline and leave the Mount Song Army headquarters to save that young array master. But your Holiness should understand, wasn't that just falling into the enemy's trap? Chen Shou finally came to his senses, just in time to hear Anhua's last few words. His Holiness believes that only a soldier like General Chen Shou can shoulder the heavy responsibility of defeating the demons. Anhua looked at the important figures in the hall as she spoke. Divine Generals Cheng Tao and Jian, she had extremely nasty complexions, while Tianhai Chunwan was even more shocked. He thought it can't be right. He was prepared to interrupt Anhua, but it was already too late. Anhua concluded, His Holiness the Pope believes that General Chen Shou should be promoted to Divine General. He is the best candidate to guard the Mount Song Army headquarters. These words silenced the entire room. It was even quieter than when they had confirmed that the master of the Cinnabar Pill was Chun Changshen. The truth of that bloody night in the snowy mountains was not important to these important figures. The Pope's whereabouts, or life or death, was not a domain they could touch. Was their true goal in coming to the Mount Song Army headquarters not the position of Divine General? What did the Pope mean by this? Did he want to use a single sentence to snatch it away? The Prince of Zhongshan's complexion grew uglier and uglier. It was still that deep voice that spoke at just the right time. At the most crucial moment, the one speaking was still that old fox, Tianhai Chunwan. Those who should be punished will be punished, but not even His Holiness the Pope can interfere in the affairs of the court, let alone military affairs. Anhua was very calm, showing no reaction. She had already completed all the tasks that the Pope had ordered her to do. As for how things would develop later on, she had no idea, but she was confident that the Pope had already made plans and had assuredly arranged them properly. Just as she thought, a clamor came from outside the headquarters, and then a voice came in. The Li Palace has never interfered in the affairs of the imperial court, but since someone in the imperial court dares to plot against His Holiness the Pope, an explanation must be given. All the officers and soldiers of the Mount Song Army headquarters involved in this case must be captured and handed over to me to be brought back to the capital for interrogation. Hanqiu City must be sealed today. No one from the Zhu clan or the emotion-severing sect is allowed to escape. As for the Tianhai clan, when I return to the capital, I will naturally pay them a visit. That voice was extremely gloomy, but it faintly contained boundless ruthlessness. His words were even more unyielding to the extreme. After only 4 sentences, the man entered the hall from outside the main gate of the military headquarters. That person was dressed in a blue Taoist robe and exuded an austere aura. The Mount Song Army headquarters was heavily guarded, but no one dared to stop him, because he was Linghai Jiwang, the cruelest and most murderous of the Sacred Hall archbishops of the Li Palace. This was because Archbishop Enlin and Taoist Baishur were right beside him, because the cold mountain was angry and the hoofbeats were like thunder. The 3 prefects of the Orthodoxy arrived at the Mount Song Army headquarters. 2,000 papal cavalrymen were outside Mount Song. A crow perched on the eaves of a building deep within the headquarters, cawing. On the mountain peaks, even further back, the white snow on the black cliff stood out in stark contrast. The cold winter wind howled, stirring up a few wisps of snow and ruffling the black feathers on its body. Compared to the howling of the wind, the area under the eaves was so quiet that one could even call it a deathly stillness. Chapter 805. 3 Sacred Hall archbishops and 2,000 papal cavalrymen were a mighty force. Of course, this was the battlefield on the northern border, and the Mount Song Army headquarters had several thousand black armored cavalry under its command. If they really had to fight, they naturally had a chance. The problem was that Ning Shiwei and his most trusted subordinate officers had already died in the deep night of the snowy mountains. The position of Divine General of the Mount Song Army headquarters was empty, and the several thousand black armored cavalry, and even more ordinary soldiers were all in a state of panic. They simply didn't know whose orders they should listen to. The most important problem was that even if someone dared to stand up and give orders, who would dare to take on this responsibility? Divine General Chung Tao and Divine General Jian Shi belonged to different camps, and Snow Pass and Blue Pass had always found each other displeasing to the eye. But now, in the face of the Orthodoxy's powerful pressure, they had no time to care about their old grudges. They looked into each other's eyes and attempted to obtain some sort of assistance or support from the other. The Prince of Zhongshan and Tianhai Chenwen were no longer looking at each other, because their previous wariness and worries had already become reality. 3 years ago, Zhou Tong was executed by 1,000 cuts on the snowy street. The previous pope returned to the Sea of Stars. Chen Chongsheng succeeded him, and then quietly vanished in the snow. The capital quickly regained its calm, and the situation steadily advanced. Many people guessed that this was probably some sort of agreement between the Orthodoxy and the imperial court, or more accurately, between Shang Xingzhou and Chen Chongsheng, master and disciple. As long as he did not remain in the capital, nothing would happen. The Pope was not in the Li Palace, but was comprehending and cultivating in the world. This was the first time in history that such a situation had occurred. Everyone knew that this was actually the Pope being exiled, but no one looked down on the young Pope, much less laughed at him. In the eyes of the common people, he was only willing to leave for the sake of the overall situation, for the sake of all living beings, for the sake of resisting the demons. In the following 3 years, Chen Chongsheng truly did not return to the capital. Other than the one time he appeared on the battlefield of the snowy plains, no one even knew where he was. In these 3 years, the Orthodoxy had similarly been extremely silent. The Li Palace was quiet. Those famous stone pillars had become much older, and the ivy on the walls was covered in dust. The Grass Moon Guild was silent in the twilight. The osmanthus flowers in the Palace of Pure Osmanthus exuded a honey-like fragrance, but no bees came to visit. The House of Moss was still as dark as before. The tile-roofed platform looked like a quiet porcelain after being washed by the rain. Many maple trees outside the Department of Traditional Education had been moved to the autumn residence. The Temple of Natural Law in the snow was extremely deserted. The Archbishop of the Hall of Literary Glory, Taoist Baishur, the Archbishop of the Hall of Illustrious Persons, Mao Chiyu, the Archbishop of the Hall of Subjugation, Taoist Siyuan, the Archbishop of the Divine Edict, Enlin, and the Archbishop of the Hall of Drifting Clouds, Linghai Jiwang. Each of them held a treasure of the Orthodoxy and resided in one of the 5 Taoist halls. They paid no attention to the secular world and rarely saw outsiders. Only the Grass Moon Hall was currently without a master. The Heavenly Tao Academy and the other 5 Ivies strictly enforced the rules. The Taoist churches in the various prefectures also kept a low profile. The all-school martial exhibition ended without any success, and even the Ivy Festival and the Grand Examination were stopped for 3 years. On the surface, the reason given by the imperial court was that the demon army was invading the south and the situation was tense, so they had to pause, but everyone knew the real reason. The Lingyan Pavilion had been turned into ruins by the Divine Empress, and the Orthodoxy did not agree to open the Li Palace to the public. What meaning was there in this grand examination? Only in the late autumn of this year, when the snowy mountains welcomed that bloody night, and on this winter day, did the world finally learn of some news about the Pope. At this moment, 3 prefects of the Orthodoxy led 2,000 Orthodoxy cavalry out of the capital. Without anyone knowing, they arrived at the Mount Song Army headquarters in the distant north. What did they want to do? This was the Prince of Zhongshan and Tianhai Chenwen's deepest wariness, their greatest unease. After 3 years, the Li Palace was finally no longer maintaining its silence. The Orthodoxy was prepared to once more make its voice known to the entire continent. What did this mean? Has His Holiness the Pope finally begun to miss home? The Prince of Zhongshan stood up and sarcastically said, "If this means a civil war in the Great Zhou dynasty, then this is truly marvelous." Back then, in order to have the Divine Empress spare his life, he had not hesitated to pretend to be a madman and treat himself so cruelly. So what did he have to fear? But today, his opponent was also a very unyielding person. Linghai Zhuang, the youngest of the prefects of the Orthodoxy, was an extremely rare Sacred Hall archbishop with military experience. If the Pope had not summoned him back to the capital, he would have long ago become a divine general of the Great Zhou, his seniority even greater than that of divine generals Chang Tao and Jianxi. In truth, if Chen Changsheng had not appeared, many people believe that he and Taoist Siyuan were the most likely candidates to become the next pope. What did a person like him have to fear? And this was not even mentioning the fact that he had endured in that gloomy and damp place of the Moss Institute for 3 whole years. Not only had his violent nature not been smoothed out, it had long ago reached the verge of exploding. "Your Highness is muddle-headed." Linghai Zhiwang's unyielding and callous voice echoed through the Mount Song Army headquarters. The crowd on the street and a few people of slightly lower cultivation in the army headquarters felt like a clap of thunder had exploded in their ears, and they couldn't help but feel dizzy. He stared into the Prince of Zhongshan's eyes and harshly said, "Should the Orthodoxy not respond to the assassination of His Holiness the Pope?" The Prince of Zhongshan's gaze was extremely sharp. "Secretly mobilizing the Orthodoxy cavalry to the northern border is your response." "Correct." Linghai Zhuang raised his chin and proudly said, "Because I want to investigate this case." The assassination of the Pope was naturally a massive case, but how was this case to be investigated? It was the 4 sentences he had said before entering the Mount Song Army headquarters. The Tianhai clan would hand over the person. Not a single person from the Zhu clan or the emotion-severing sect would be able to escape. All the officers and soldiers of the Mount Song Army headquarters would be captured and brought back to the capital for the Li Palace to interrogate. The imperial court would have to give a clear explanation. If they really did as Linghai Zhuang demanded, the Great Zhou would assuredly be thrown into turmoil. The Prince of Zhongshan remained unmoved. He impassively asked, "And if I agree to your 4 conditions?" The matter of the snowy mountains had nothing to do with him. Although he had once thought about seizing the cinnabar pill, he had not had the time to act. That is what the imperial court should do. Linghai Zhuang had no intention of backing down because of his words. He harshly said, "But before the Li Palace can clearly investigate this case, no one can think about becoming the commanding general of the Mount Song Army headquarters, because it might affect our investigation." Tianhai Chenwen sighed and asked, "Unless His Holiness the Pope designates this person to do it?" He was naturally speaking of Chen Chou. The Prince of Zhongshan's complexion turned even nastier. Truly preposterous. Linghai Jiwang's face was expressionless, cold and detached, just like his voice. The cinnabar pill is His Holiness the Pope's pity for all living beings. There are people in the court who are so daring as to scheme for this treasure and even plot to harm His Holiness. Do you really think that you won't have to pay a single price? And even if you agree to these 4 conditions, what use is there? Would the Prince of Xiang dare to agree? I am currently trying to save up manuscripts. Once I reach 20,000 characters, I will write as many as I can every day. When the time comes, I should be able to write a little more. Chapter 806. Zhu Yi, Ning Shiwei, and Tian Haizhani had all died in the snowy mountains that night. In truth, no one knew what they had done, so it was probably impossible to use this to implicate those figures in the capital. However, what they wanted to do was no secret. Anyone could see that the orthodoxy's demand that the imperial court pay a corresponding price was very reasonable. His Majesty is merciful, but my temper has always been bad. If you don't agree to my request, then this case will continue to be investigated. Linghai Zhuang took a step forward and stared into the Prince of Zhongshan's eyes. Your Highness, it would be best if you carefully consider whether you can bear the burden. The Prince of Zhongshan's face was frosty, but he said nothing. He was keenly aware that no matter how long the Pope's assassination was investigated, it would be impossible to find the Prince of Xiang. However, the Zhu clan that had lost the protection of an expert of the divine domain might very well be exterminated. Putting aside the 1,000-year friendship between the Chan imperial clan and the Zhu clan, just the promise made to Zhu Luo was something that neither the Prince of Xiang nor he could allow to happen. Tian Haichunwen also maintained his silence. The crime of assassinating the Pope was far too great. If Tian Haizhani was stained with this crime, it would be difficult to wash his name clean. The current Tian Hai clan was no longer the Tian Hai clan of the past. If the Li Palace really did come with a thunderous momentum, the Tian Hai clan truly would not be able to hold out. Actually, investigating the case this way was very unreasonable. The people involved were all dead. Other than Chun Changsheng's letter and these 2 people, there was no other evidence. For the orthodoxy to meddle in the affairs of the court and want to arrange the position of divine general of the Mount Song army was also very much against the rules. But the orthodoxy had done it without the slightest concealment. Who asked that person to be the Pope? Just as Linghai Jiwang had said, the imperial court had to pay a price. The question was this enough? Would that be enough to settle this matter? We will wait for the result in the Taoist temple. I hope that the sooner the discussion is concluded, the better. Before Linghai Zhuang left the headquarters, he said to the Prince of Zhongshan, in addition, please tell His Highness the Prince of Xiang that all of this is only the beginning. As expected, this was just the beginning. In the once more quiet Mount Song army headquarters, the important personages from the capital all had their own worries, but they all coincidentally thought of these words. Mother asterisk Kerr. The Prince of Zhongshan suddenly jumped up and pointed at the noses of the 2 divine generals as he cursed. Are you 2 pigs? They even dared to snatch his things. How dare you touch him? At this moment, a servant of the prince's mansion came to the door and coughed softly. Everyone understood. They didn't want to bear the wrath of this mad prince, so they quickly took their leave. Before Tian Hai Chunwen left, the Prince of Zhongshan pulled on his sleeve. The Prince of Zhongshan whispered, the Tang clan knows that the master of the cinnabar pill is Chun Changsheng, and the palace also knows, but I do not know, the Prince of Xiang does not know, and you do not know. Do you not think that there is something wrong with this matter? Thinking of the Tang 17th master who had also died in the mountains and the fact that no one from the Tang clan had appeared today, Tian Hai Chunwen felt a tinge of wariness. Thanks for the reminder. After Tian Hai Chunwen left, the personal attendant of the prince's estate came to the Prince of Zhongshan and offered him a letter. There was no content on the cover of the letter, but there was the most complicated seal. The Prince of Zhongshan tore open the letter and read its contents in silence for a very long time, his complexion growing more and more gloomy. So the Qiushan clan already knows. That old fox, did he calculate the time to send the letter? In the end, the trial became a negotiation. With no agreement yet reached, the important figures flicked their sleeves and left, but the matter in the court spread like wildfire. In a very short amount of time, everyone in the town of Mount Song knew of what had happened in the mountains that night. Of course, the rumors were somewhat absurd. A divine general had actually plotted to harm the Pope, and some other faction had intervened. In the end, those wicked people had all died under the Pope's divine punishment. The most shocking of all was naturally that the mysterious master of the cinnabar pill was actually the Pope. The Pope had actually refined the cinnabar pill from the jade blood of his innate sacred body. 3 holy carriages, escorted by countless orthodoxy cavalry, left the army headquarters and headed for the Taoist church in the west. The crowd parted like a tide and prostrated. This was because 3 important figures of the orthodoxy sat within the 3 holy carriages, and also because the people were sincerely thanking the Pope for his benevolence. Some of them had clear and spirited eyes, clearly cultivators. Some of them wore the uniform of array masters, and all of them were more or less wounded. When the orthodoxy's carriages passed by, these people silently prostrated. Several of them had rather complex expressions on their faces, but they also prostrated on the ground. Cultivators only kneeled to the heavens, the earth, the sovereign, and the master. They naturally did not kneel to the 3 prefects of the orthodoxy, but to the Pope. All of them had once suffered severe injuries on the battlefield. If they had not been fortunate enough to obtain the cinnabar pill, they would have long since become white bones in the yellow earth. Only today did they find out that they had been saved by His Holiness the Pope, and that His Holiness the Pope had used his own sacred blood. When they thought of the Pope's benevolence, how could they not be moved to tears? And when they thought about how the Pope's blood flowed through their bodies, how could they not feel reverence? Even those cultivators belonging to other factions could not disregard the Pope and leave, so they also prostrated on the ground. The chilly winter wind lifted up the curtains, but it was unable to pour in. Just like the holy carriage of Holy Maiden Peak, the Lee Palace's holy carriage also had a similar array. There was no wind in the carriage, and it was as warm as spring. And Lynn's gaze pierced through the curtains and fell upon the crowd on the street. When she saw those cultivators and array masters, she froze for a few moments. After some time, she muttered, "His Holiness the Pope seems to be different from back then." This was a sigh of sorrow, a sigh, and it carried a very deep meaning. As one of the prefects of the orthodoxy, the Archbishop of Revelation, just what did her sigh of sorrow mean? And Hua sat at her side and heard these words loud and clear. She very quickly understood what Chun Chantian meant. The back then was actually just 3 years ago. 3 years ago, Chun Changxing was a calm and determined young Taoist. But today's struggle for the position of Divine General of the Mount Song Army Headquarters and the countless gazes of admiration drawn by the cinnabar pill all seemed to indicate that his view of the world and his way of handling it had undergone many changes. "Aunt, you misunderstand His Holiness the Pope. Publicizing the matter of the cinnabar pill was my idea." And Hua looked at Archbishop and Lin and solemnly said, "The journey of a saint naturally needs to be publicized. Only in this way can people be guided to do good. No?" And Lin faintly smiled at her niece and lovingly stroked her hair. She thought to herself, "You're now filled with reverence for His Holiness the Pope. So how could you know that the young Taoist who first entered the capital did not have words like reverence in his mind?" Chapter 807. Do you know just how dangerous your actions today are? I'm carrying out His Holiness the Pope's decree. What danger is there? And weren't His Holiness and the 2 archbishops hurrying over? And Lin thought to herself, this child has been cultivating in the 13 divisions of Radiant Green for so many years, unconcerned with worldly affairs, but she's still so naive. The 6 halls of the Lee Palace have lost their key for 3 years. It seems like they've been quietly defending, but they've actually been under enormous pressure this entire time. Her smile faded as she calmly and seriously said to Anhua, "In the end, the venerable Taoist is a saint of the orthodoxy, and he is now the #1 person in the world. More and more people in the orthodoxy are willing to follow in his footsteps. Even if His Holiness returns to the capital, he may not be able to control the situation. The Orthodoxy only has one pope. And Hua seriously said, "Aunt, His Holiness will always support His Holiness, right? 3 years ago, when His Holiness the Pope returned to the Sea of Stars, I, Mount Qiuyu, and the others received the final warning. So we will naturally protect him to the end, but..." And Lin's gaze passed through the front wall of the carriage, probably resting on the carriage in front of her. In the end, the venerable Taoist is His Holiness's teacher. I don't know what other people think. And Hua very seriously thought this over and felt that there was no need to think about this matter. To her, the Pope was the only divine being. Linghai Zhuang and Taoist Baisher sat in the same carriage. The gazes of these two prefects of the Orthodoxy never met. They were very calm, even somewhat cold. The cheers, praises, and kowtows from outside the window did not cause their eyes to waver. Only when a cold wind blew up a withered leaf and struck it against the window did Taoist Baisher's expression slightly relax. It seems that His Holiness's wanderings in these 3 years were not a waste of time. His methods have become much more ruthless. He still did not turn his head to look at Linghai Zhuang, his voice flat like that of a dead man. As the Archbishop of the Hall of Literary Glory, I actually only learned of the entire matter last night. His Holiness was able to conceal it even from us. It truly is admirable. Chun Changsheng naturally had a way to communicate with the Li Palace, or else 3 prefects of the Orthodoxy would not have been able to bring 2,000 Orthodoxy cavalry so quickly to the Mount Song Army headquarters. The problem was that Taoist Baisher did not know this method of communication, and in his view, Linghai Zhuang probably did not know either. Everyone was well aware that the relationship between Linghai Zhuang, Chun Changsheng, and the Orthodox Academy was extremely terrible. If not for Chun Changsheng, he might very well be the current pope. Taoist Baisher's words could be said to be an emotional sigh, a praise for the pope's wisdom, but could also be understood as a provocation. Linghai Zhuang's face remained expressionless, just like the vast majority of the time. When a second withered yellow leaf struck the window lattice, he finally spoke, but wasn't to reply to Taoist Baisher's sigh. Why hasn't anyone from the Tang family shown up yet? This turn of events was very sudden and stiff, so it sounded a little cold. Taoist Baisher frowned slightly. I don't know. Linghai Zhuang's gaze left the window and turned to Taoist Baisher. He turned his head very slowly, like a puppet. One could even faintly hear his cervical vertebrae grinding against each other, like a sword slowly being unsheathed. Before Mu Jiushi was expelled from the Li Palace, I didn't even consider her to be a member of the Orthodoxy, so I've always been the youngest of us. I still have a lot of time, so I can wait. Don't say some nonsense like Qin Changsheng is younger than me, and don't put on that dead face of yours and pretend to be unworldly and thoughtless. Linghai Zhuang stared into Taoist Baisher's eyes and said, "Although I've never liked this pope of ours, if he were to be assassinated twice in a row, I would be countless times angrier than I am now, because this is a provocation to the Li Palace, a humiliation to me. And when I am truly angry, you should be well aware of what I will do." After saying this, he once more turned his head to look out the window. It was like he had done nothing or said nothing at all. The Orthodoxy's carriage did not stop for long in Mount Song. This was because the imperial court's imperial envoy, the prince of the mountain of Mount Song, and those important personages did not need much time to reach a conclusion and agree to the Li Palace's conditions. Chun Chou, the former commander of the 7 Lishi cavalry, had become the new divine general of the Mount Song Army headquarters. This news shocked the people of Mount Song, especially those officers who knew of Chun Chou's record and his demotion. As for the reason for this matter, it shocked the people of even more places like Blue Pass, Snow Pass, Xuanyang City, and even the capital Luoyang. It turned out that the Pope, who had vanished for 3 years, had always been on the battlefield in the north. He had never forgotten the human soldiers who were bathed in blood with the demon armies. He had not hesitated to consume his lifespan to use his true blood to refine the cinnabar pill to save countless lives, and then he had encountered an assassination in the snowy mountains. After 3 years of silence, the Li Palace had suddenly spoken, using this matter to forcefully seize the position of divine general of the Mount Song Army headquarters. What did this mean? The exiled pope seemed about to reappear before the eyes of the world. So was he about to return to the capital? Behind Mount Song, there were high mountains everywhere. Countless paths ran through the mountains, and crude pavilions or grass huts would often be built at the turns of the mountain paths. In the bustling world of the south, these grass huts or pavilions should be called parting pavilions or parting houses. They were used to prolong the time of separation and allow one to feel the sorrow of parting. Here, these pavilions or grass huts were only used to shelter from the rain or to rest for a while. On the battlefield, one could be forever separated from the heavens at any moment, parting by life and death. It was very difficult for a living parting to make one feel too much misery. Luobu used 2 fingers to hold the small wine pot as he gazed down the mountain at the mist-shrouded Mount Song. He was silent, his thoughts inscrutable. Chen Changsheng and Nank stood at his side. Following his gaze, they realized that there was nothing there at all. After leaving Sloping Cliff Horse Farm and arriving here, according to their agreement, it was time to part. The mountain path split into 3 paths, south, north, and west. North was the descent of the mountain to Mount Song. North was the snowy plains, where one could encounter the demon wolf cavalry at any time. South was the crossing of the mountains, the crossing of the Sia River, and then several small mountains. In 2 days, one could see the silhouette of Honshu City. To the west was to circle around the mountains, cross the Sia River, and then climb over several small mountains. After 2 days, the silhouette of Honshu City could be seen. Further south of Honshu City was Wenshui. The place Chen Changsheng wanted to go to was Wenshui. Luo Bu, on the other hand, was going to Mount Songzhan to hand over his military seal and return home. After fighting in the northern snowy plains for nearly 5 years, he wondered if he felt a little reluctant to leave. The WeChat Q&A will be released on the official account today. Because there are too many questions, all of them added up to more than 10,000 words, so it will be released in several parts. Today is the first part. Chapter 808. A mouthful of strong wine entered his throat, but Luo Bu's expression remained indifferent. Chen Changsheng, on the other hand, felt a little reluctance to part with him. Then, "We're leaving," he said to Luo Bu. Luo Bu picked up the small pot of wine and shook it, indicating that he understood, but he said nothing. Chen Changsheng was rather unhappy. He thought, even if you don't want to speak in order to maintain your demeanor, shouldn't you at least let me drink a mouthful of wine before parting? In truth, he had been feeling rather strange these past few days. Ever since that drunken conversation by the mountain stream, Luo Bu's attitude towards him had undergone a very subtle change. It was very clear that he was no longer very willing to speak with Chen Changsheng, let alone be intimate, but there was also no hostility. It was more like he was intentionally maintaining a distance, wanting to be a stranger. But he was also not a complete stranger, because whether it was when he was taking medicine or when he was feeding the horses in the meadow, he would always feel that Luo Bu was watching him from afar. This kind of watching was more like observing. Just why was this? Chen Changsheng shook his head and no longer continued to think about these things. He could only classify Luo Bu as a strange person and lead Nang down a mountain path. From start to finish, even when his and Nang's figures had vanished into the winter pine forest, Luo Bu did not turn his head. He silently drank his wine towards the town of Mount Song. Rather than saying that he was sending off Chen Changsheng, it was more accurate to say that he was sending off himself. When the strong wine in the pot was finally emptied, Luo Bu finally stood up and walked down the mountain. He did not directly report to the Mount Song Army headquarters. Instead, he chose a very unremarkable wine shop and walked in. He had the shopkeeper fill up the empty wine pot. Then he sat at a table by the window, ordered a plate of fried soybeans, and looked out the window. 3 fingers fell onto the plate. Without even looking, he would accurately pick up 2 fried soybeans each time and place them in his mouth, slowly chewing them. It was noon. The sunlight pierced through the thick clouds and shone on the streets of Mount Song, clearly illuminating the faces of the people. the newly appointed divine general of the Mount Song Army headquarters, Chen Shou, was escorted out of the main gate of the headquarters by his subordinates. He mounted his horse and began his first patrol. Seeing his old friend's clearly much taller figure, Luo Bu chuckled and raised his wine cup in celebration, praying in his heart that he would not die early. When dusk came, the sunlight became much dimmer. The glow of the setting sun was like a flame that burned the buildings on the street and the minds of the people. He had already eaten 3 plates of fried soybeans and drank 4 pots of wine. Luo Bu's eyes narrowed more and more, not because he was drunk, but because he saw the person he wanted to see. Of course, the reason why he wanted to see those people was because he did not want to see them. These people were from his clan, and there were also some from the Wenshui Tangs, the Wu clan, and the Mutuo clan. Other than him, no one could tell them apart from the pedestrians on the street. Naturally, no one noticed that these people had left Mount Songshan and were heading west. Luo Bu continued to drink. He drank for a very long time, but his eyes did not show any signs of drunkenness. On the contrary, they grew brighter and brighter. After a very long time, he finally sighed and stood up. He asked for a basin of clean water from shopkeeper and very carefully washed his face and beard clean. Then, he sang a song that no one in the north had ever heard before and left Mount Songshan to head west. Chen Chongqing's injuries were still far from completely healed, but he could already walk normally. He had refused the dragon horse offered by Sloping Cliff Horse Farm, but with Neng's help, his speed was not slow. He was many times faster than ordinary merchants. After leaving Mount Songshan, he traveled through the mountains and very quickly left the mountains behind him. At dusk of the next day, he and Neng arrived outside Hanqiu City. As he walked along the official road to the city, he noticed that the trees on the side of the road were rather damaged, and the forest on his left was particularly messy. If he carefully looked, he could see many new shrubs and willows. It was obvious that they had suffered some extremely bitter damage several years ago. He froze, then recalled that several years ago, Zhixio and many other people had passed through this forest to enter the Garden of Zhou. At the time, a rainbow had descended from the south, tens of thousands of li away. The entrance to the Garden of Zhou had been in that seemingly real and illusory courtyard behind the forest. At the moment, the entrance to the Garden of Zhou was on his wrist, that black stone. And the key to the Garden of Zhou was no longer at the peak of the Mount Li Sword sect. It had already become his spiritual sense. He thought of many scenes from several years ago. At that time, Zhu Luo had sat in the pavilion, his long fur shawl over his shoulders, exuding an ancient aura, proud and aloof beyond compare. No one dared to approach him. At that time, Mei Lisha had sat in the carriage, silent and indifferent, not saying a single word. He was like an old plum blossom, possessing his own aura. Mei Lisha and Zhu Luo were both dead, but many of those people were still alive. Chen Chongqing turned to glance at Neng. It was in the Garden of Zhou that he had first met Neng. At the time, Neng was an indifferent and callous demon princess. Under Black Robe's orders, she had stirred up internal strife among the human cultivators in the Garden of Zhou. At the same time, she had sought opportunities to kill Su Yorong, Zhixio, and Qi Jian. She was his most frightening enemy. The current her was just a silly, ignorant little girl. She only knew to follow him, protect him, and wait for him. I don't know if you'll still remember these days after you wake up, he sighed as he looked at Neng. Neng's hand grabbed a corner of his sleeve, her eyes still lifeless. She stared at Hanqiu City in front of them, completely unaware of what he was saying. It was very obvious that she had already completely forgotten her experiences in the Garden of Zhou. Seeing her like this, Chen Chongqing could not help but sigh. On that night, in the snowy mountains, she had risked her soul to save his life, so he naturally had to keep his promise. But even now, he did not know if he could cure her. And just as he had sighed with emotion, if he really did cure her, and she still remembered these days after she woke up, would she kill him? The closer they got to Hanqiu City, the denser the forest on either side of the road, the more willow trees there were. This was a very good indication of the qi of the city. Yes, every city had its own unique qi. The capital's qi came from the green of the mausoleum of books, Luoyang's qi came from the city walls, and Hanqiu City's qi came from the willow trees. In the past, Zhu Luo had loved willow trees, so there was a myriad willow garden outside Hanqiu City, and 10,000 willow trees were also planted in the city. Now, Zhu Luo had long since become a fragment of the star beneath the mausoleum of books, vanishing like smoke, but Hanqiu City was still the same as it had been in the past, bearing many of his marks. From a certain perspective, Hanqiu City was surnamed Zhu. The Zhu clan and the emotion-severing sect possessed supreme statuses and unimaginable strength in this city. But Qin Changsheng was not worried about encountering anything here, because there was probably no one who knew of his whereabouts. More importantly, Zhu Yu is already dead, so the Zhu clan did not have any extraordinary figures. As expected, his and Nank's entry into Hanqiu City went very smoothly. The soldiers at the city gate and those disciples wearing the sword robes of the emotion-severing sect had clearly not yet shaken off the shock of their clan head's death. They appeared particularly vigilant, but in reality, their eyes were filled with confusion and unease about the future. Chapter 809. The Willow Lodge was the best in Hanqiu City. It was adjacent to the most beautiful lake in the city and surrounded by a forest of ancient willows. It was the most tranquil in the spring and summer, but in the middle of winter, when the lake was frozen and the ancient willows were leafless, standing by the window and gazing at the scenery by the starlight would inevitably make one feel rather somber and miserable. In the darkness, Hanqiu City was extremely tranquil, devoid of any noise. It could even easily make one think of a graveyard. Wangpo was still in the south and had not returned to Tianliang County, but it seemed like the Zhu clan was about to wither until it was digested. Many changes in the world would come so suddenly that one would be caught unprepared. Nang's voice roused him from his thoughts. He turned and sat down on the bed. Nang took off his shoes and socks, and then placed his feet in the basin. She lowered her head and began to carefully scrub them. The temperature of the hot water in the basin was just right. It was not hot, nor would it feel cold after a while. She had presumably just personally tested it, just like on those nights at Sloping Cliff Horse Farm. In the days when Qin Changsheng was unconscious and unable to move after waking up, Naik had been responsible for feeding him and cleaning his body. He had tried many times to refuse, but he had been unable to convince her, just like tonight. My injuries are almost completely healed. In the future, can I do these things myself? Not good. Nank did not even raise her head. She could not remember anything, only that Qin Changsheng was the most important person to her. Then she should properly take care of him, ensure that he lived a healthy life and recovered as quickly as possible. Qin Changsheng thought it over, then very honestly said, "I'm not sure if I can cure your illness, but only you can cure it, right?" Nank raised her head and stared into his eyes as she spoke. Because her soul had left her body, the distance between her eyes no longer widened, but her eyes still seemed rather lifeless. When she focused so intently on something or someone, it was actually rather frightening. But Qin Changsheng was already used to it. After washing up, Nank very naturally untied her luggage and laid out the bedding on the floor. However, she did not go to sleep. Instead, she very naturally took off her clothes and sat in front of Qin Changsheng. On those nights before leaving Sloping Cliff Horse Farm, Qin Changsheng had begun to treat her illness. Even though she was now an imbecile girl, Nang could still vaguely sense that being naked in front of a man was not a good thing. But now she was used to it. Qin Changsheng's finger brushed past the stone bead. His divine sense entered the garden, and he took out his short sword. Then, he took out a golden needle from the vault sheath. True essence was poured in, and the tip of the golden needle began to tremble slightly. It pierced through Nank's seemingly delicate but actually extremely hard to break skin and probe into her meridians. In these past few years, he had cured Luo's illness, cured Xianyuan Po's injuries, and had also treated Jixio for a very long time. His ability to observe down to the smallest detail through the golden needles was much stronger than when he had first arrived in the capital, but he still did not have the confidence to cure Nank's illness. because Nank was not a demi-human, but a demon. Through these few nights of treatment, Chun Chong Sheng had a deeper understanding of the demon's body, and the more he understood, the more he felt it was unbelievable. The bodies of demons and humans seemed to differ very little on the surface, especially for a member of the imperial clan like Nank, but in certain aspects, there were enormous differences. These differences were mainly concentrated in the meridians, ethereal palace, chi openings, and sea of consciousness. Demons had meridians, but they did not have chi openings, much less ethereal palaces. Most importantly, the sea of consciousness of demons was not like that of humans or demi-humans, which was an ocean formed from true consciousness. It was more like a mist of light. The problem was, were the lights in the mist shards of consciousness, or some sort of objective existence? Chun Chong Sheng was very curious about the light that was faintly discernible, yet omnipresent and ever-present, because he faintly felt that he had seen it somewhere before. Regretfully, although Nank had done her utmost to open up her consciousness, Chun Chong Sheng still could not delve into the depths of her sea of consciousness, unless he was not worried that his consciousness would invade her and turn her into a true idiot, or that she might just die. As a result, he could not see the true appearance of those lights. Zhu Ye's remains had already been secretly transported back to Hanqiu City, but they had still not been buried, because the Zhu clan and the emotion-severing sect did not know what to do. His remains were badly mutilated, as if they had been gnawed on by wild beasts, but the cold and cheerless Hanqiu City was on the verge of becoming a graveyard. Even if the venerable Taoist and the Prince of Xiang continued to protect the Zhu clan for the sake of Zhu Luo, how could a clan without a true expert survive in this treacherous world? And this wasn't even considering the fact that the entire continent knew that Wang Po would one day return to Hanqiu City to take back what he had lost. The myriad willows garden outside Hanqiu City seemed to have predicted today's situation. Several years ago, it had been set ablaze, burning paper money ahead of time for Wang Po. Not far from myriad willows garden was the ancestral grave of the Zhu clan. Only the heads of the Zhu clan, or those elders who had made enormous contributions, had the right to be buried there. The starlight tonight was very bright, illuminating the tombs and gravestones. If one carefully read the characters on the gravestones, one would be able to understand the entire history of the Zhu clan and the emotion-severing sect. In the depths of the graveyard was a thin and small figure, his back hunched. He was waving his hands as he dug at something, his mouth constantly muttering something. The starlight fell on his face, making his crooked eyes and nose seem even more terrifying, more frightening than all the gravestones put together. The saliva that came out of his mouth stank to no end, even more stinky than the corpse water in all the graves that had been dug up. Yes, this petite hunchback man was digging graves. His slender fingernails were filled with soil and rotting flesh, but for some reason, they were incomparably sharp. Very quickly, he was able to dig up a grave. In less than an hour, all 17 graves of the Zhu family's ancestral graves had been dug up by him. Whether it was rotting corpses or white bones, they were both the most beautiful harvest for this thin and hunchbacked man. His eyes glowed, and his saliva flowed even more. He let out an extremely indistinct and incomprehensible voice. Only by listening very carefully could one understand the general meaning. Your Zhu clan is about to be destroyed. Then give me your resentment and your departed souls. I will help you kill your enemies. The hunchbacked man suddenly sat cross-legged on a lotus seat, his palms facing the stars as he closed his eyes and began to meditate. He was clearly using the most orthodox Taoist techniques of the orthodoxy. In the starlight, his expression was dignified, even somewhat divine. But his nose and mouth were crooked and his eyes could not be completely closed, making him look very ugly. The most orthodox divine techniques of the orthodoxy, the most beautiful starlight, and the ugly hunchbacked man. This stark contrast was somewhat comical and absurd, but for some reason, it was also terrifying. Chapter 8:10. In the abandoned myriad willow garden, countless auras appeared among the tombs. This chi was very faint, but it carried a bone-piercing chill. It was different from the chi of the demon experts, different from the black frost dragons, seeming even more sinister and foul. Buried in this tomb were generations of experts of the Zhu clan, the vast majority of them at the upper level of star condensation. Although Zhu Luo and the other two experts of the divine domain were only cenotaphs, there were still fragments of their souls. As for that sinister and filthy feeling, it came from the corpse poison on the rotting bones. The starlight seemed to dim at this moment. The aura gradually gathered towards the hunchbacked dwarf and was drawn into a jade bottle in front of him by the divine power he released. Not even the Li Palace had any relevant records of using the most orthodox of divine techniques to collect the filthiest shattering corpse poison. This was because this method was far too ancient. Only a few places could preserve its inheritance, such as some sects of the southern faction of the Orthodoxy, Holy Maiden Peak, or the Longevity sect. And if an important member of the Tang clan were present, they might be able to recognize that the Imperial Design Array in the capital was very similar to this array. With the passage of time, the energy in the tomb became fainter and fainter, all of it entering the small jade bottle. The hunchbacked dwarf opened his eyes and looked at the small jade bottle in front of him. His eyes were filled with greed and excitement. He carefully brought the small jade bottle to his nose and sniffed it. There was clearly no smell, but his face revealed an intoxicated expression. The small jade bottle was half filled with liquid. It was clear and transparent like water, but it was relatively viscous, more like some kind of honeydew. The fish sauce and rosin were the dew of death, and so was the liquid in the bottle. This was the dew of the Yellow Springs. The night deepened and the starlight brightened once more. The graveyard outside, the myriad willows garden, had returned to its original appearance. No one could see that this place had ever been dug up, and no one knew that the departed soul corpse poison of the past powerhouses of the Zhu family had already been collected away by some inconceivable method. The hunchbacked dwarf returned to the inn named Willow Lodge. He was already very short, and with his body hunched and head lowered, as well as the black curtain hat covering his head, it was impossible to see his face. After leaving the mountain gate, he had been living and walking in the deep mountains and wild forests. He rarely met people because he felt inferior. It was only after he had learned to dress like this that he felt somewhat satisfied. This was what he had learned from the great figure of the demon race that night on the snowy plains. He walked into the kitchen from the side door of the inn and squatted outside the window like a dog, looking at the sky above the courtyard wall, waiting for the arrival of the morning light. The sound of chopping onions and the chef's reprimand came from behind the window, which was then covered by the fog. He got up and walked into the kitchen. Looking at the label on the food box, he found his target. He took out a small jade bottle and dripped a few drops onto the plate. Today, Lu Su's breakfast was Hanqiu City's famous jade tofu. When the liquid from the jade bottle dripped onto the tofu, it looked like honey and was very appetizing. The food boxes were quickly taken out of the kitchen and sent to the corresponding guest rooms according to the labels so that the guests could wake up in a good mood. The hunchbacked, thin man squatted back outside the window and looked at the increasingly bright morning light. He thought about what would happen later. His eyes gradually narrowed, and he was in a good mood. However, nothing happened. The morning sun had already leaped over the horizon and even crossed the low wall in front of him, but the inn was still very quiet. He could hear the sounds of washing and talking, and he could even hear the clinking of the money in the waiter's pocket, but he did not hear the two people's hearts stop beating. The warm red light of the morning sun shone on his ugly face, and his rusty eyes seemed to shrink to the size of a grain of rice. He walked back to the kitchen and saw the food box in the waiter's hands. He confirmed that the jade tofu on the plate had been completely eaten. He very slowly tilted his head, very confused. He sniffed the plate that only had some juice left, confirming that there was no smell. For some reason, the waiter seemed to be completely unable to see him. It was a very strange sight. He muttered to himself, "Not dead? How is that possible?" The waiter suddenly heard a voice come from the air beside him. Startled, he almost cried out. The reason he did not cry out was that a hand covered in black hair and scales had suddenly reached out of the air and grabbed him by the throat. The hunchback dwarf appeared and expressionlessly gazed at the waiter, his eyes devoid of any human emotion. The waiter had never seen such an ugly, disgusting thing. He struggled in fear, but he was unable to escape. The hunchback dwarf thought for a moment, then carefully took out a drop of liquid from the small jade bottle and dripped it onto the waiter's face. In an instant, the waiter's body stiffened, and he could no longer struggle. A black spot appeared on his face and then quickly spread to the rest of his body. In an extremely short amount of time, a living person had become a lifeless, pitch-black statue. Just like that, he died. The hunchbacked dwarf observed the waiter's transformation and thought to himself, "There's no problem." His facial features were all gathered together, and he seemed especially distressed. A chilly morning breeze blew in from the window, dispersing the remaining mist in the kitchen and simultaneously dispersing the waiter's corpse in a countless strands of black smoke. Facing the light of the morning sun, the black smoke quickly became transparent, no longer visible. Nank had already finished packing her luggage. Chun Changsheng stood by the window, looking at Hanqiu City under the morning sun. He finally felt that this city had gained some vitality. But in the next moment, he felt a strand of vitality seep away. He did not know where this feeling had come from or why he had suddenly felt it. Countless creatures lived in the world. At every moment, there were lives being born, and there were also lives passing away. The fact that he could feel it meant that the loss of vitality was related to him. He drew back his gaze and looked at Nank. Just at this moment, Nank also raised her head. Their gazes met in the air, and they saw the wariness in each other's hearts. Nank's gaze moved once more, ultimately resting on a certain spot on the floorboard in front of them. Passing through the floorboard would lead them downstairs to a room to the right. With a thought from Chun Changsheng, countless sword glows appeared in the room. The countless rays of morning light coming in from outside the window instantly lost their color, their luster dimming. Countless sword intents descended with extreme sharpness. In just an instant, the floorboard had noiselessly disappeared, turning into dust dancing in the morning light. Chun Changsheng and Nank landed on the ground. Just as their feet touched the ground, the stone wall in front of them began to dissolve, turning into the finest powder that scattered in all directions. The stone wall disappeared, revealing the scene behind it. There were still chopped onions on the chopping board, and the iron pot beneath the steamer was still steaming. It was clear that this was a kitchen. A strange person stood in the middle of the kitchen. Chapter 8:11. The reason he was called strange was naturally because this person was different from normal people in many aspects. This person was very short. From the outside, Nank was only a 12-year-old girl, but this person was 2 heads shorter than Nank. This person was very ugly. No matter how beautiful the morning light was, when it fell on those seemingly randomly stitched ears, mouth, and nose, it became loathsome. The person's back bulged high. It seemed to be a hunchback. This person wore a black robe. The robe was very clean, but for some reason, there was a stench coming from it. Seeing this skinny, short, crippled, and reeking person, the vast majority of people would feel loathing. Once they calmed down, they would perhaps feel pity and sympathy. Chun Changsheng did not. The moment he saw this person, his wariness became incomparably intense. It was just like the feeling he had when he saw Zhou Tong under the crabapple tree in the alley of the Northern Military Department. He felt like he saw the ultimate, unreasonable, unpersuasive, and undilutable evil. This person's evil was slightly different from Zhou Tong's evil, more sinister and filthy. "Who are you?" Chun Changsheng asked the freak. The man's ugly face revealed an uneasy expression, because the morning light was too bright, and he had forgotten to use his hat to cover his face. He had been seen by someone, which made him feel inferior once more. Thus, he once more felt the desire to destroy the world. When he thought of destroying the world, the freak felt much calmer, so he began to laugh. This freak's smile was also very strange. When he laughed, the corners of his mouth would completely open, revealing those messy, sharp, and bestial teeth. It was a very terrifying sight. "Since I can't kill you stealthily, I can only try to kill you on the spot. This person's voice was also very unpleasant to listen to, like two broken pieces of porcelain rubbing against each other. It was extremely grating. After saying this, he extended his hands and made a gesture at Chen Changsheng. In the bright morning light, one could clearly see that his hands were covered in hair and scales, a rather disgusting sight. But Chen Changsheng's attention was not on this, but on the gesture his hands had made. In reality, he had never seen such a gesture, but he was well read in the Taoist canon and had once seen a similar scene in a very ancient Taoist scripture. This was the most orthodox of the Taoist sect's hand seals, an ancient technique that had long since been lost to the orthodoxy. Whether it was the Li Palace or Holy Maiden Peak, there was no longer any legacy of this technique. This person exuded a calm and peaceful aura that could even be described as sacred and solemn. However, there was a faint black aura gathering between his hands. Within it, there was lightning forming, and there was an even more filthy and sinister aura. To use the most orthodox and ancient divine arts of the orthodoxy, but to use the most sinister methods, just what sort of monster was this? Chen Changsheng's pupil shrank. His right hand gripped the hilt of the sword at his waist. Seeing that this sudden battle was about to begin, no one expected that a new change would occur. The hunchback man suddenly looked up and said exasperatedly, "Why do you have so many helpers?" After saying this, his figure suddenly became illusory, and he was about to retreat out of the window. How could it be so easy to escape from Chen Changsheng and Nang's eyes? Countless sword intents were faintly discernible around the kitchen, sealing off all the exits. In a streak of clear light, Nang disappeared. Chen Changsheng was not worried that the freak would be able to escape. In such a short distance, there were not many people who could be faster than Nang, even if her two wings had mysteriously vanished. However, what happened next completely surpassed his imagination. At the same time that Nang disappeared, the freak also disappeared. Countless gusts of wind whistled through the air, bringing with them countless wisps of steam rising from the pot. The morning light spilling through the window incessantly flickered. It was very obvious that the two of them were moving at high speeds through the room at a speed that the naked eye could not follow. Even with Nang's lightning-fast speed, she was actually unable to catch the freak in a short amount of time. The wariness in Chen Changsheng's heart intensified, and the right hand that gripped the hilt of his sword slightly tightened. With several scrapes, several extremely clear sword slashes appeared on the beams of the room. Several swords pierced through the morning light and pierced toward a certain place. A roar filled with pain and anger resounded through the air. The freak was forced to reveal himself. A sword wound had appeared on his right shoulder, and a foul stench of blood slowly seeped out. Several dark green lights pierced through the air, grabbing at the freak's throat. They were Nang's fingers. Rip! The freak's clothes were suddenly torn to shreds. Two gray shadows appeared behind him, moving his body with unimaginable speed to the other side, avoiding Nang's attack. As it turned out, he was not a hunchback at all. The bulge on his back was actually a pair of wings. There were no feathers on those wings, and they looked more like gray balls of meat. They were rather disgusting, but they moved extremely quickly. The gray shadows moved wildly, bringing with them a foul stench of wind. The freak directly smashed through the stove. Rumble! Under the flurry of swords, the stove instantly disappeared, but there was no trace of the freak. Chen Changsheng and Nang stood next to the ruins of the stove, looking at the black hole in the ground in silence. Nang withdrew her spiritual sense and said, "It leads underground, and it's filled with filth." I don't know how he was able to pass through. Seeing this scene and hearing Nang's words, Chen Changsheng fell into deep thought. Or was it that extremely ancient Taoist scripture that had once described a similar scene? That was a story from an extremely long time ago. Tens of thousands of years ago, a pope, in order to pursue the realm of grand freedom, had once comprehended an extremely sinister cultivation method. It was to separate one's worldly thoughts from one's desires, creating a corresponding self outside of one's main soul. Through observing one's own body, one could comprehend the truths of the world and then sever it with one strike of the sword, achieving true peace. That pope had made extremely ample preparations, but he had not expected that the evil soul would be even more sinister and terrifying than he had anticipated. It could borrow the turbid chi of the world to grow at an unimaginable speed. In the end, when he wanted to sever the thought, he had not been able to completely succeed, and even almost suffered a backlash from the evil soul. He had no other choice. At the final moment before his soul was completely polluted, he could only borrow the wills of the 12 sages from the Great Hall of Light to forcefully exterminate himself and the evil soul. Just like that pope of vast knowledge and incomparably profound cultivation died. This Taoist technique, known as corpse severing, naturally became a forbidden technique of the orthodoxy, gradually vanishing into the long river of history. Who could have expected that this Taoist technique would reappear before his eyes today? Before that pope left, he had said to the archbishops of the Li Palace that if the corpse severing was not successful, the Yellow Springs would appear. Could this monster be the Yellow Springs? At 8 o'clock in the evening, there's another chapter. Yes, after half a year, there are finally 2 chapters, even though there aren't many words. Shake hands. I wish everyone a happy weekend. Chapter 8:12. The 3,000 scriptures of the Taoist canon only contained records of that period of history, but no concrete explanation of that Taoist technique. Qin Changsheng could not confirm whether or not that monster was the legendary Yellow Springs. He wrote 2 letters, one to the Li Palace in the capital and the other to Holy Maiden Peak in the south, hoping to obtain more information from these 2 places. That monster had clearly come to kill him, but he didn't know what it had done, or perhaps it hadn't had the time to do anything. Putting aside the mysterious origins of that monster, Qin Changsheng had already mentally prepared himself for this matter. The words that Linghai Zhiwang had asked the Prince of Zhongshan to pass on to the Prince of Xiang in the Mount Song Army headquarters were the stance that he wanted the orthodoxy to express to the entire continent. He was keenly aware that this was also the situation that he would soon face. This was only the beginning. It was just like when Su Li was heavily injured on the snowy plains of the Land of Demons and encountered something similar on his journey south. He was now the Pope, but the number of people that wanted to kill him was no less than the number that wanted to kill Su Li. It was obvious that someone already knew that he was in Hanqiu City, but he was confident that the Zhu clan would not act. Just as expected, when he and Nank left the Willow Lodge and headed for the southern gate of Hanqiu City, they sent several spying gazes, but no one appeared. Then, in front of a perfume shop, he met an unexpected person. This person was dressed like a scholar, his handsome face brimming with an unconcealable arrogance, as well as a hint of inexplicable joy. He was called Bi Tianxin. He was dressed like a scholar because his father would often appear like this in front of the common people. His father was Biyang Hong, and his mother was Wuqiongbai. Several years ago, in the capital, in order to suppress the Orthodox Academy, the new faction of the Orthodoxy, led by Linghai Zhuang and Daoist Siyuan, pushed for the all-school martial exhibition. With the new faction of the Orthodoxy and the Tianhai clan at the head, countless cultivators went 100 Flowers Lane to challenge the Orthodox Academy. Bi Tianxin had once been one of those people, and he had been the most arrogant of them all. However, with a letter from his father, Sima Yu did not return to the Li Palace Academy after leaving the Mausoleum of Books. Instead, he directly entered the Orthodox Academy. Many people knew that the stances of these 2 powerful figures were different, so this challenge naturally ended without any results. Bi Tianxin had never seen Qin Changsheng again. He had only seen this name from the mouth of the storyteller and from the imperial edicts. Only today, in Hanqiu City, far from the capital, did he once again see that unremarkable face, one that he was not familiar with, but one that was absolutely unforgettable. Could he not help but be dumbfounded? He had come to Hanqiu City to represent the elders of his clan in discussing some matters with the Zhu clan, but more importantly, he had come to see someone. He had never expected to see Qin Changsheng here. His heartbeat quickened, and his mouth went dry from surprise and nervousness. The entire continent wanted to know Qin Changsheng's whereabouts. So why did he have to meet him in Hanqiu City? What happened next? What should he do? Do I need to take the initiative to greet him? Just as he was thinking about these things, Chen Changsheng had already walked past him. Chen Changsheng saw Bi Tianxin and recognized him, but he acted like he didn't see him. On the contrary, it was Nank who curiously glanced at Bi Tianxin. In the depths of an extremely secluded estate in Hanqiu City, Bi Tianxin narrated the scene of his encounter with Chen Changsheng, his brow slightly creased in distress. The person he was speaking to was a young girl. Her features were moving, her cheeks slightly red, and she seemed rather cute. Perhaps it was because she was drinking wine. "You're afraid of him?" The young girl's voice was very gentle, but her tone was not. It was tinged with faint ridicule, as well as a natural sense of superiority. These three simple words were not very respectful to Bi Tianxin or Chen Changsheng, because she was saying that Bi Tianxin was afraid of him, and also because he was directly addressing Chen Changsheng as him. Bi Tianxin was the only son of two storms of the eight directions, and Chen Changsheng was the Pope. There were very few people on the continent who had the right to speak of them in this tone, and there were even fewer young girls of this age, like Luo Luo or Nank or the little black dragon. Very coincidentally, they were all people at Chen Changsheng's side. The young girl was not Chen Changsheng's friend, but she still dared to speak like this, because she was not a person of this continent. She came from the great western continent. Just like Luo Luo and the others, she was also a princess. Mu Jiushi, the most mysterious of the orthodoxy's 6 prefects, had all her glory and power snatched away by the previous pope, but that glory and power belonged to the orthodoxy. As long as her bloodline still existed, she possessed glory and power that no one could ignore, and her status was still revered. This was because she was Madame Mu's younger sister. From a certain perspective, she represented the will of the great western continent. Bi Tianxin looked at her face and listened to her voice, and his body somewhat softened. It was not out of fear, but out of love. 3 years ago, when they had coincidentally met in the capital, he had fallen in love with her, loved her to death. No matter how one looked at it, she was worthy of his love, had the right to be loved by him, and was his most suitable marriage partner. So even though her words were filled with ridicule and contempt, he still did not get angry. He only wanted to explain that he had no other choice. Who would be afraid of that fellow? It's just that he's the Pope right now, and little sure you're a person of the great western continent, so it naturally doesn't matter, but I'm still different. It was obvious that Mu Jiushi did not care about his explanation. She put down the wine pot and walked into the courtyard. She gazed at the somewhat gloomy sky. After a few moments of silence, she suddenly asked, "Why did he come to Hanqiu City?" Bi Tianxin thought this over, then solemnly said, "Could it be that he wants to go to Wenshui?" Anyone could see through this, so was there any need to think about it? Mu Jiushi did not turn around, so Bi Tianxin could not see the hint of ridicule on her lips. He could only hear her praise. "Brother B's words are very reasonable. Then we should immediately notify the capital and Wenshui." Bi Tianxin smiled. "Relax, I'll do it in a little while." Mu Jiushi softly said, "Don't mention me." Bi Tianxin's smile faded as he sighed. "Little sure, I know that your great western continent is not as calm as it seems on the surface. Back then, even Madame Mu was forced to leave her home, let alone you. Thus, you don't dare to let others know of our matter, but you really don't need to be afraid of anything. As long as my parents know of this matter, would your elder brother dare to do anything to you?" Mu Jiushi turned around and asked, "But your parents, what would they think?" Bi Tianxin gazed deeply at her and said, "As long as I like it, my parents will definitely like it." Mu Jiushi seemed moved. Walking up to him, she looked into his eyes and softly asked, "How much do you like me?" With his lover before him, Bi Tianxin was incomparably satisfied. He sincerely said, "I'm willing to die for you." Mu Jiushi lightly leaned against his shoulder. Gazing at the ancient scholar tree in the courtyard, she softly said, "Truly good." Her hand was placed on his chest. It seemed like she was blocking out of shyness, but in reality, she only needed to circulate her true essence to shatter Bi Tianxin's ethereal palace. Then he would truly die. Chapter 8:13. In the secluded courtyard, A man and a woman embraced each other, their deep affection for each other. Across from the courtyard was an ancient scholar tree. Even the cold winter, it still had a few leaves. A blue-clothed man stood beneath the tree. The blue-clothed man wore a copper mask, making him look just like a ghost. Mu Jioshi's head rested on Bi Tianxin's shoulder as she calmly gazed at the blue-clothed man. This was truly a very strange sight. Bi Tianxin sensed nothing. The blue-clothed man shook his head, the shadows left behind by the ancient scholar tree leaves on the copper mask faintly moving. Mu Jioshi slightly creased her brow and closed her eyes, no longer looking at the man. Bi Tianxin sensed her movements and his heart warmed. He wanted to reach out, but he did not dare. After some time, the cold wind rustled the scholar tree as Bi Tianxin reluctantly left the courtyard. Mu Jioshi walked under the ancient scholar tree and stared at the blue-clothed man's eyes through the copper mask. She asked, "Why didn't you let me kill him?" The blue-clothed man's voice was like gravel. "You should be well aware that killing him is only our method, not our goal." Mu Jioshi's voice became shrill, brimming with anger. "I finally managed to get Chun Changsheng to meet that piece of trash, so how could I miss this chance?" The blue-clothed man replied, "Even if you kill Bi Tianxin, you can't pin the blame on Chun Changsheng." Mu Jioshi sneered. "Is the Black Frost Dragon breath not enough evidence? You must know that in the current continent, only he has one at his side." The blue-clothed man replied, "The problem is that Zhu Sha is not at Chun Changsheng's side today." Mu Jioshi froze, then asked, "Then who is the girl at his side?" The blue-clothed man replied, "I don't know, but someone is currently investigating." Mu Jioshi recalled the scene from before, her beautiful face revealing an expression of extreme disgust. "Then how much longer do I have to endure?" The blue-clothed man fell silent for a few moments, then replied, "No one knows when the most appropriate time is. This requires waiting." Mu Jioshi sneered. "Are we just going to watch as Chun Changsheng enters Wenshui City?" The blue-clothed man lovingly rubbed her head and said, "Even if he enters Wenshui City, he won't be able to affect the situation in the city or the general situation outside the city. The majority of the people living in that city have the surname Tang. Not even Tianhai and Yin were able to do anything back then. So what can he do? Of course, in order to prevent accidents from happening, many people will try to keep him outside, including me. A beard that looked like a messy shrub might attract some fearful and repulsive gazes in the prosperous and gentle Tiannan, but in the north, this land that had been watered by blood and fire for many years, it would only provide you with many conveniences. For example, you could curse and snatch another customer's bowl of liquor from the hands of a wine shop owner, but no one would dare to say anything. It was just that it was a little inconvenient when he was drinking. Whether it was a small sip or a bold gulp, it was easy for the wine to wet his beard. At that time, it seemed like a very carefree and unrestrained thing. But after waking up from a drunken stupor, it was always sticky and unpleasant, and he had to wash it several times. After growing his beard for 3 whole years, Luobu looked at the wine dripping from his beard and, for the first time, began to consider whether or not he should shave his beard. And then he was a little startled, thinking, when did I start to care about these trifles? The sight of his bearded face and mouth eating meat and drinking wine had occurred to him countless times. Why had he not cared when he was riding in the 7 Li Shi, nor had he cared when he was at Sloping Cliff Horse Farm? But now he had a different thought. Perhaps it was because he had gotten to know a fellow who was especially fond of cleanliness in the last few days. When that fellow first woke up, he couldn't even move his fingers, so he hurriedly used his eyes to signal others to help him wipe his face. Even while recovering from his injuries, he did not forget to change into clean clothes every day, just like a woman. Luo Bu suddenly fell silent, thinking, does Junior's sister like this kind of guy? At this moment, he sensed something and raised his head to look out of the wine shop. He saw Bi Tianxin walking out of the alley. Early this morning, he had seen Bi Tianxin outside the perfume shop, so he had followed him here. He had discovered that secluded courtyard in the alley, but he had not entered because he had vaguely sensed that there was someone in the courtyard and that this person was very strong. Luobu took out a charcoal pencil and began to draw on the white paper he had prepared. He was drawing Bi Tianxin and his surroundings, like that alley in the corner of the scholar tree that could be faintly seen deep within. It was obvious that he was very skilled in this field. With just a few careless strokes of the charcoal pencil, he could make out the rough outlines of the alley and the scholar tree. As for Bi Tianxin's drawing, as the tip of the pencil moved, it became clearer and clearer until it was lifelike. Those two eyebrows seemed about to fly up, just like they were real. If the painter at Wang Zhiz's side saw this drawing, he would assuredly think of a way to snatch him back to Sangarama Temple to be his disciple. Yes, his drawing was just this good, just like in any other field. After finishing, he did not leave, but continued to sit in the wine shop and wait. After a long time, he finally saw the person he wanted to see. Mu Jiushi and the blue-clothed stranger wearing a copper mask rode away in a carriage. Coincidentally, a gust of wind blew past, raising the curtain over the window. It was just a glimpse, not even enough to leave a sufficiently clear image in the eyes of a person, but Luobu's brush could. It didn't take long for a painting to be completed. This painting was extremely rich in detail, faintly possessing its own charm. Anyone who knew Mu Jiushi and the blue-clothed stranger would never mistake it for someone else. As he gazed at the two people in the painting, Luobu arched his brows and said, "The great Western continent truly does have ambitions, but just who will it fall on?" Chen Changsheng did not believe that his meeting with Bi Tianxin in Hanqiu City was a coincidence, as the probability was too small. This meeting had most likely been arranged by someone else, which also meant that his whereabouts were no longer a secret. In truth, the monster he had encountered in Willow Lodge had already proved this point. There was still 1,000-some li between Hanqiu City and Wenshui, and he would encounter many things on the road. If it were up to him, he would naturally not be willing to enter this sort of situation. After leaving Sloping Cliff Horse Farm, he would not inform anyone in the orthodoxy and would first rush to Wenshui City. But the letter had clearly stated that if he wanted to safely return to the capital, he first had to find that person. Just who was the person who had leaked his whereabouts? In the wilderness, he had learned swordplay from Su Li, and he had also learned the art of war and strategy. But because of his personality, he had never been able to understand the complexity of a human heart and the complexity of the world. Fortunately, the person who had written the letter understood these things very well. So he now basically knew the answer to this question. It was very simple, because only 3 people knew of his itinerary. Chen Changsheng gazed at the white stones on the side of the road in silence for a very long time. In the following period of time, the first chapter will probably be updated in the afternoon. If it is not updated by 9 o'clock in the evening, then it means that there will not be a second chapter, so everyone does not need to wait. If a situation like the 3rd chapter mysteriously occurs, I will inform everyone. Chapter 814. It was clear that these stones had been washed by water for many years to become so pure and white. Not far in front of him was a river. It was currently the dry season of winter, but if it were summer, the river would probably have flooded this place. There were 2 paths to Wenshui. One path followed the river, while the other took a detour to the north, making it more difficult to travel. Chen Changsheng chose the northern path. This was not the same as the itinerary he had planned out, but it was also planned out. To the northwest of Hanqiu City was a large and lifeless mountain range. After passing through this mountain range and around a large swamp, one would arrive at the Tsong Province Army Headquarters. The Tsong Province Army Headquarters was the most remote of the Tinsum Army Headquarters in the north of the Great Zhou, already extremely close to the territory of the demi-humans. As they walked through this desolate mountain range, Chen Changsheng very naturally recalled that Xue Xingchuan had made his fortune in the Tsong Province Army Headquarters. Then he recalled Madame Xue and that young master of the Xue clan who had apparently entered the Orthodox Academy last year. Then he recalled Luoluo, whom he had not seen for many years. The sun hung in the western sky, much of its light filtered out by the dust it kicked up. It seemed to be in a rather bad mood. Just when they were about to cross over a mountain, an extremely wary expression suddenly appeared on Nang's small face, her pupils constricting. Although she was currently a fool and had completely forgotten the matters of the past, she still possessed the strength of a cultivation, and she was extremely sensitive to the dangers hidden in the world. Chun Changsheng glanced at her. Nank raised her small face and sniffed the air, just like a puppy. "What's that smell?" Chun Changsheng asked. "The smell of blood. A very strong smell of blood." Nang's voice was flat and her emotions very indifferent. It was like she was talking about the smell of food. Chun Changsheng asked, "Do you smell the stench of that monster?" After leaving Hanqiu City, that monster had not appeared again, but he remained vigilant. If that monster really was of the Yellow Springs lineage, as he had judged, it would be very troublesome. Nang shook her head. After lowering her head and thinking for a while, she continued to walk up the mountain ridge. On their journey from Hanqiu City, the gravel on the ground was the same color as the sky, gray and hazy. But when they crossed over this mountain, the color of the world instantly changed. The other side of the mountain was red, not because the landscape had changed, but because it had been dyed red by blood. There was blood everywhere. There were dead bodies everywhere. Some of the corpses were like small mountains. From the coarse hair and the unique helmet shape, they should be warriors of the brown bear tribe. There were also many corpses of human soldiers. The stones on the ground were dyed red by the blood, and there was sticky blood everywhere, giving off a fishy smell. It was as if a small-scale war had just taken place here. Amongst the corpses that littered the ground, only one person was still alive. He slowly stood up and turned to look at Chun Changsheng. In such cold weather, he only wore an unlined shirt, and his sleeves were rolled up, exposing his forearms. At the same time, his trousers were shorter than the average person's, which made him look a little comical. However, if one thought that he was running and wielding his sword, they would feel a chill down their spines. He was still the same as before. Chun Changsheng seemed to see the youngster standing under the morning light outside of Li Palace during the grand examination. The morning light flickered, and 5 years had passed. Chun Changsheng walked towards him. Zhixiu came to greet Chun Changsheng. Chun Changsheng opened his arms, preparing to give Zhixiu a passionate embrace like Tang 36. But Zhixiu gripped his sword, a smear of red faintly visible in the depths of his eyes. He was actually preparing to undergo berserk transformation. Chun Changsheng followed his gaze and realized that he was staring at Nank. Only then did he understand and say, "I'm fine." Zhixiu did not relax his guard. He stared at Nank and asked, "What's going on here?" Back in the garden of Zhou, he had not truly met Nank, but given his personality, he had naturally done a great deal of research and was prepared to meet her again in the future. He had not expected that the next time he saw this demon princess, she would be at Chun Changsheng's side, and she was clearly his follower. Chun Changsheng lowered his arm and used his eyes to indicate that it was not convenient to talk about it in detail. He said, "I'll explain it to you later." He then turned to the ground littered with corpses and asked, "And what's going on here?" "Someone was worried that you would leave from the north and sent people to kill you." Zhixiu's tone was still as flat as before, or perhaps apathetic, as if nothing could cause his mood to change too intensely. Like these bloody scenes and the scheme hidden behind them, assassinating the Pope was no small matter. Nank's voice suddenly rang out, filled with wariness and distrust. "You killed all these people?" She did not recognize Zhixiu, but she could sense how dangerous he was. Wariness was natural, and distrust was also natural. To be sent to kill Chun Changsheng, these bear warriors and human soldiers were assuredly extremely powerful, and there were assuredly many experts among them. No matter how skilled Zhixiu was in battle, he could not have killed so many enemies by himself, and not a single one of them had escaped. Chun Changsheng also found it very strange. Even if Zhixiu had advanced by leaps and bounds in the snowy plains in the last 3 years, he should not have been able to reach this level. "I have companions," Zhixiu said. As if to prove his words were true, many mournful wolf howls suddenly came from the distant mountain ridge. "A few little fellows from the tribe sneaked out and are now following me. In addition, there are also a few acquaintances in Tsong province." Zhixiu said to Chun Changsheng, "The brown bear tribe has always been crafty. We laid an ambush here for 3 days, and then..." Qin Changsheng was suddenly in a very good mood and paid no attention to the rest of Zhixio's story. The wolf tribe's attitude toward Zhixio seemed to be undergoing some sort of change, and he even now had acquaintances. In the past, this would have been a very difficult matter to imagine. Zhixio, who was destined to be a lone star of heavenly evil, actually had companions? It seemed like the days spent in the Orthodox Academy had brought about some unforgettable changes to every person who had lived there. On the same night, the three of them spent the night in a desert on the other side of the valley. Up in the wind, they could not smell the scent of blood. In the blink of an eye, Zhixio had dug out a cave about 3 zhang deep in the hard and cold ground. The bottom of the cave was very dry and somewhat warm, so there was no need to worry about being harassed by wild beasts. This was how Zhixio had lived since he was very young. Nank laid out a blanket at the bottom of the cave and lay down. Qin Changsheng took out his needles and began to treat her. By the time he finished, Nank was already asleep. He pulled the blanket up to her neck and then left the cave. Zhixio squatted on the ground outside the cave, looking in some direction. He was still habitually squatting, not sitting. He was like a lone wolf, ready to attack or flee at any moment. Chapter 8:15. The desert at night was very cold. There was no wind, and the dust kicked up during the day quietly fell back to the ground. The air was very clean. The stars in the night sky were so dense that they seemed unreal. Xining village was only several hundred li away from the cloud grave, and there was often fog. Qin Changsheng had only seen this sort of starry night in the wilderness when he was returning south with Su Li. The bright starlight spilled over the desert, and some of the star radiance was also gathered onto the golden needle between his fingers. This was the best method of cleansing. "Turn around," Qin Changsheng said to Zhixio. Zhixio turned around, not asking why. In the Orthodox Academy, in the mausoleum of books, this sort of conversation had taken place many times. It was very familiar. The golden needle slowly pierced into Zhixio's neck, and then Qin Changsheng's fingers began to tremble. Zhixio's brows slightly rose. Qin Changsheng knew that this represented pain, because Zhixio did not like to furrow his brows in pain. That would make him seem weak. If even Zhixio felt pain, then just how much pain was it? Qin Changsheng poured true essence into his meridians and began to examine the current state of his body. Zhixio closed his eyes. After some time had passed, an indescribable stream of true essence surged through Zhixio's meridians like a tide. Corresponding to it was the blood in his veins. Qin Changsheng's fingers holding the golden needle were almost jolted away. Zhixio's eyelids trembled. This was Zhixio's illness, the tide rush of blood. Whether in medical books or in the Taoist scriptures, this sort of innate illness caused by the conflict between bloodlines was a terminal illness, incurable by any medicine. It was precisely for this reason that Su Li and the Mount Li sword sect had been so unyielding in the matter between Zhixio and Qi Jian. Qin Changsheng did not loosen his fingers, but continued to silently wait. At the same time, he inserted 2 more needles into Zhixio's other 2 meridians. After some time, he finally pulled out the needles. Staring into Zhixio's eyes, he asked, "You didn't take your medicine on time?" After killing Zhou Tong, he and Zhixio had left the capital one after the other. Although they had both come to the north, they had never met. But he had already written out a prescription, clearly specifying the method to take the medicine and the things to pay attention to. Tonight, although Zhixio's condition could not be said to have worsened, it also did not show any signs of improvement. There was definitely a problem. Looking at Qin Changsheng's serious and bright eyes, Zhixio couldn't help but feel apologetic, but his expression didn't change. "We're fighting all the time. Whether it's to investigate the enemy's situation or to pursue and assassinate, we need to travel long distances. Sometimes we even have to hide in the snow for 7 days and 7 nights." He said, "How can I have time to take medicine? Besides, it's troublesome to eat your medicine, and I have to boil it. I can't start a fire." Qin Changsheng didn't know what to say. After a moment of silence, he said, "Then I'll think of another way to see if I can make it into a pill." Zhixio thought of that rumor and asked, "You gave me the cinnabar pill to eat?" Qin Changsheng nodded. More than a year ago, he had thought of a way to resolve the conflict between the divine laws of the two worlds. After refining the cinnabar pill, he immediately had Gigi deliver it to Jishio, and then he realized that his blood had no effect on Jishio's illness. There was a rumor going around that the cinnabar pill could revive the dead, but this was actually a rather exaggerated claim. The cinnabar pill truly did have a miraculous effect on those wounded on the battlefield who had lost too much blood, but it definitely could not cure all illnesses. For example, Jishio's illness or Nank's illness, whether it was the tide rush of blood or the soul in chaos, they were both extremely rare and strange illnesses. Jishio asked, "Can my illness be cured?" Qin Chang Sheng's medical skills were extremely brilliant, and his understanding of the meridians was unparalleled. If not even he could cure Jishio's illness, then there really was no one who could. Qin Chang Sheng did not attempt to deceive him. He whispered, "The situation isn't very good." Jishio was very calm, or perhaps numb. After a moment of silence, he asked, "Then what about her?" Qin Chang Sheng shook his head. "I still haven't found a way. I've only used medicine and needles to help her calm her mind and stabilize her soul. When I look at her, it doesn't really seem like she's a fool. There are thousands of kinds of fools. Then how will she wake up? I can only hope that she'll encounter some sort of lucky encounter and wake up on her own." Jishio looked into his eyes and said, "Have you ever thought about what would happen if she really did wake up?" Qin Chang Sheng found it impossible to imagine such a scene. After a moment of silence, he said, "We'll talk about it when the time comes." Jishio said, "Even if she can't wake up, if her identity is recognized, it will still be a major problem." Qin Changsheng understood what he meant. Nank was not an ordinary person. She had never been a person. She was a demon, and a demon princess at that. Back then, even with Su Li's strength and methods, he had to conceal his love for a demon princess from everyone in the world. His daughter had to conceal her identity and be raised in Mount Li, let alone him. Of course, his situation was different from Su Li's. He and Nank did not have this sort of relationship, but if he always kept Nank by his side, he would have to face this problem sooner or later. Jishio's question made him think of that demon princess who had died in the longevity sect's cold pool, and then he thought of that night in the mountains and the conversation between the two demon lords. At the time, the young demon lord had been very shocked when he saw the heavenly demon horn, because the people of Shualao City all believed that 20-some years ago, when that demon princess left, she had taken this sacred object with her to the human world. Who could have expected that 20-some years later, the heavenly demon horn would reappear in his father's hands? Compared to the many things that had happened that night, this was a minor matter. But now that he thought about it, this matter concealed a great deal of information. If the heavenly demon horn really had been taken out of Shualao City by that demon princess, then after her death, the heavenly demon horn was most likely lost in the longevity sect. Why had the heavenly demon horn reappeared in the demon lord's hands? And then he thought of that little monster he had encountered in Hanshio City that flowed through the Yellow Springs. An ancient legacy that not even the Li Palace had. So, just where in the world could it be preserved? Of course, it was the equally ancient longevity sect. Qin Chang Sheng said nothing, his expression gradually turning solemn. Finding that person in the orthodoxy who was colluding with the imperial court was naturally very important, but even more important was finding that person who was colluding with the demons. After that night in the mountains, he had been constantly pondering this question. With the help of someone, the young demon lord had so easily deceived the eyes of countless people and replaced the young array master on the stretcher. Now it seemed that the person colluding with the demons was not one person, but an entire sect? Or perhaps a great clan? Chapter 816. Qin Changsheng suddenly asked, "Could the longevity sect have colluded with the demons?" Jishio replied, "The ancestral hall of the Southern Taoist sect is an orthodox sect, so it doesn't make sense." What he said didn't make sense was not a moral judgment, but a consideration of benefits. Betrayal always required benefits, and the longevity sect's foundation was in the human race, in the Taoist faith. What benefit could they gain from colluding with the demons? Chun Chongqing asked. But have you ever thought, if they weren't colluding with Xiulao City, how would the longevity sect have been able to capture Qi Jian's mother? This truly was a problem. The demon princess's movements were assuredly extremely secretive. Logically speaking, she should not have been so easily captured by the longevity sect. After you finish talking about the snowy mountains, I've also been thinking about this problem. Zhe Xiu continued. The longevity sect has been too ruthlessly slaughtered by Su Li. Even if they still have some potential in the south, they can't hide from the Mount Song Army headquarters. Qin Chongqing looked into his eyes and asked, what if they had other helpers? Zhe Xiu understood what he meant, and a chill flashed through his eyes. They were going to Wenshui to pick up a friend, but it now seemed that they would have to ask a few more questions when the time came. The darkness enveloped the desert, and low roars could be heard in the distance. Perhaps some wild beasts were munching on those corpses. In their previous conversation, they had mentioned Qi Jian's parents many times, so the conversation continued along this line. Chun Chongqing asked, how long has it been since you last met? Zhe Xiu thought it over, then replied, 5 years. Time passed neither quickly nor slowly, and it was very easy to become numb, to forget many things. Chun Chongqing asked, do you still remember her? Zhe Xiu thought of the mad dash through the garden of Zhou, the life and death they had shared in the plains of the unsetting sun, him carrying her on his back and her leading the way, and the lines on his face gradually softened. He did not answer Qin Chongqing's question because he did not need to answer, just like he did not need to remember because he had never forgotten. Don't worry. After your illness is cured, we'll accompany you to Mount Li to propose. Of course, that is, if she hasn't forgotten you. How could the great sects of the South think highly of a lonely ghost like me? And in the eyes of the common people, I've always been a monster. You're not a lonely ghost. You're the vice superintendent of the Orthodox Academy, and besides, Mount Li is still different. Then what about you? How is Su Yurong now? We haven't heard from her in a long time. Hearing Zhe Xiu's words, Chun Chongqing calmed down, his face filled with longing and worry. The letter from Wenshui City had stopped for half a year, while the letter from Holy Maiden Peak had not been received for almost 2 years, and the two of them had not seen each other for 3 years. She's in seclusion. Chun Chongqing was silent for a moment and continued. Closed-door cultivation. Cultivators would only enter into closed-door cultivation at the most critical moment, because this was an extremely dangerous method of cultivation. No one knew when they would be able to break through, and it might take a few months, a few years, or even a few decades. It was even possible for them to pass away in meditation within their abodes. Su Yurong's talent was astonishing. Her closed-door training would definitely be different from others. Presumably, the risk would be even greater. However, Zhe Xiu could understand why Su Yurong would choose to go into seclusion. Holy Maiden Peak needed a true holy maiden. The Li Palace needed a true ally. Thus, she needed to break through that threshold in the shortest amount of time possible and enter the domain of the divine. Zhe Xiu didn't know what to say, so he could only pat Qin Chongqing on the shoulder to express his comfort. After not seeing each other for 3 years, they had spoken much more than they had in the past, but in the end, they were both not good with words, not like that fellow in Wenshui City. At this moment, a figure suddenly appeared on the mountain ridge in the distance. At the same time, a tough and cold voice rang out. No matter who you are, don't even think about escaping. Qin Chongqing and Zhe Xiu instantly had the misconception that that fellow really had appeared. That figure walked down from the mountain ridge and finally arrived in front of them. It wasn't that fellow, but this fellow truly was very similar to that fellow in certain aspects. As a result, when they first met, they had immediately opposed each other, so much so that they wanted nothing more than to clash swords. This person was a swordsman. His entire body was covered in dust, but could not conceal his threatening, heroic spirit. Chun Chongqing and Zhe Xiu had just spent half a day talking about Mount Li, and someone really did come from Mount Li. Guan Fei Bai, the fourth of the Divine State's 7 laws, a genius of the sword from Mount Li. In terms of talent, he was only below Qiushan. Jun Guan Fei Bai was the fourth of the Divine State's 7 laws, a genius of the sword from Mount Li. In terms of talent, he was only below Qiushan Jun. Then he remembered that Chun Changsheng was no longer an ordinary student of the Orthodox Academy, but the Pope. They were familiar with each other, but this generation of disciples of the Mount Li sword sect was very different from their martial granduncle. They did not have the thought of not standing on ceremony. He bowed to Chun Changsheng and said, paying respects to His Holiness the Pope. Chun Changsheng had long since stood up and solemnly returned the bow. Guan Feibai had many questions he wanted to ask, but he hesitated. Chun Changsheng asked, "Why did you come?" Guan Feibai replied, "I received orders to leave Blue Pass to investigate the enemy. I happened to discover the strange movements of the Brown Bear tribe, so I followed the clues and came here." Zheshio glanced at him, a rather surprised expression on his face. "You're a scout?" Guan Feibai arched his brows. "Are you the only one allowed to do it?" Compared to the Grand Examination and the Mausoleum of Books, there didn't seem to be much change. Back then, in this generation of inter-sect disciples of the Mount Li sword sect, the only person Chun Changsheng had some conflict with was Guan Feibai. The reason was very simple. His personality was too hard, his temper was bad, he was excessively violent, and his mouth was unforgiving. In certain aspects, he was rather similar to Tang 36. Other than friends on the same side, no one liked this sort of person. It was just like how in the eyes of the common people of the Orthodox Academy, the most loathsome student would always be surnamed Tang. Later on, Chun Changsheng's impression of Guan Feibai underwent a massive change. It was not because of their interaction at the Mausoleum of Books or the Grand Assembly of Boiling Stone, but when the Orthodox Academy was suppressed by the imperial court with all its might and no one dared to support it. Guan Feibai came. He exchanged a few indifferent words with Chun Changsheng, and then he requested that Chun Changsheng personally escort him out of the academy. This was an attitude, and he did not mind letting this attitude be seen by the entire capital. Chun Changsheng was very grateful and said, "Thank you." Guan Feibai said, "You're welcome." To these youths who had experienced Sun Mei's attempt at the Divine Path and Wang Po's farewell, these two words carried an extremely important meaning. From now on, we are friends. They were all killed by you? Guan Feibai pointed at the mountain behind them. Chun Changsheng turned to Zheshio. Zheshio said nothing because he did not like to talk. Chun Changsheng had no choice but to explain himself. In the past few years, the Brown Bear tribe and the demons have always been secretly colluding. It was only last year that they saw our side flourish that they began to draw closer. Their foundation was never clean, and they were easy to order around. Guan Feibai looked at him and asked, "The problem is just who wanted to kill you?" Chun Changsheng replied, "We want to go to Wenshui." It was a very simple sentence, but Guan Feibai understood. After a moment of silence, he asked, "Is that guy okay?" I know that Zheshio's line about not needing to remember, because it has never been forgotten, is too sour, too much of a lyric, but I thought about it a few times and still didn't delete it. Chapter 817. I don't know. Chun Changsheng shook his head. It's already been half a year since we've heard from him. Guan Feibai was quiet for a while, then suddenly said, "I'll go with you." Chun Changsheng was somewhat surprised, and Zheshio also raised his head. From the Ivy Festival to the Grand Examination, to viewing the monoliths in the Mausoleum of Books, and then to the Boiling Stone Summit at Mount Han, Tang 36 and Guan Feibai would quarrel whenever they met, their swords drawn and bows bent. Why did one go to Wenshui? Seeing the two's gazes, Guan Feibai felt somewhat uncomfortable. Can I not go and make fun of him for being useless? Fine, do as you please, Chun Changsheng said with a smile. Zheshio shook his head, thinking to himself, it's already been so many years, but why is he still so childish? Chun Changsheng asked again, what about Blue Pass? Although your Mount Li sword sect still listens to orders, it's not good to leave on your own accord. Guan Feibai replied, we agreed beforehand that once I finished this matter, I would return to Mount Li. At the next town, I would have the relay station bring a letter back. Chun Changsheng was somewhat surprised. You were originally planning to return to Mount Li? Second brother should have already left Snow Old Pass by now. All of us senior brothers will return. Because the demons have withdrawn. That's part of the reason. The main reason is that eldest brother wants to return to Mount Li. Hearing this, Chen Changsheng fell silent for a while, then asked, "In these past few years, where has your senior brother gone?" In the eyes of the world, he had already disappeared for 3 whole years, but Qiu Shanjun had already disappeared for 5 whole years. Just where had Qiu Shanjun gone? This was a matter that everyone was very curious about. We also don't know. Guan Feibai looked at Chen Changsheng, wanting to say something, but in the end, he said nothing. Anyone would think that Qiu Shanjun's disappearance was inevitably related to him. To be more precise, it was related to his engagement with Su Yurong. Chen Changsheng was quiet for a very long time, then said, "I've never met Qiu Shanjun, but if he really is as you describe him, I believe that he would definitely not hide from the world because of emotional grief." In the depths of the night, the stars were the brightest. From the top of the mountain, one could clearly see the scenery on the ground. Outside Hanqiu City, with this mountain ridge as the boundary, the world was divided into 2 halves. On one side was the fertile land that had been irrigated by the river for countless years. Even in the depths of winter, it still retained some greenery and did not give off any sense of desolation. On the other side was the mountain valleys and the desert, completely devoid of life, completely desolate to the extreme. If one wanted to get to Wenshui, one could go anywhere. Luo Bu didn't know how Chen Changsheng would choose, but what he wanted to know was how those pursuers in the forest would choose. There were many experts among the pursuers. Some were from the Tang family, some were from the Wu family, some were from the Mutuo family, and some were from his own family. Simply put, these people were the elite forces of the 4 great families. If Chen Changsheng was really intercepted by these trackers, no one could predict the final outcome. Under the starlight, the mountain forest was filled with an unreal and illusory beauty. What happened next made Luo Bu feel unreal. The pursuers from the 4 great families did not choose any path. After receiving reports from several scouts, they retreated along the original path after some discussion. Luo Bu had a deep understanding of the cautious and conservative conduct of these noble families, so he only needed a few moments of thought to guess at what might have happened. These pursuers were unable to confirm which path Chen Changsheng had chosen, so if they wanted to continue the pursuit, they would need to divide their forces. This sounded like a very simple arithmetic problem, just dividing 1 into 2, but the mutual deception between the noble families made this problem even more complicated. Moreover, they were not confident that they could kill Chen Changsheng with just half their forces. Even more importantly, the hand signals from the scouts had clearly indicated that the situation on the river path to the south had changed. So they had to consider whether this was a trap set by the orthodoxy. Luo Bu glanced at the dazzling white of the stone mountains and desert in the north, then turned and walked down the mountain ridge. Using the cover of the forest, he quickly arrived at the river. In the darkness, he silently walked along the river, all the way until the morning sun rose. As the morning light fell, it painted the meandering river into a silver belt. This river was a tributary of the Wenshui, flowing south. Compared to the stone mountains and desert in the north, it was relatively warm. But it was still late winter, so the river was still frozen and covered in a thick layer of snow. Up ahead, the river bent to the right, and a clump of winter sweet grew between the protruding cliffs. Luo Bu walked up to this clump of winter sweet and raised his eyes to see those people on the distant river. Many holes had been torn in the ice and snow on the river, spreading out in all directions for several dozen zhang. At the end of each hole lay a black-clothed person. The ice and snow were stained with blood, and the black-clothed people were unconscious. It was impossible to tell whether they were dead or alive. From this sight, one could imagine just how world-shaking that exchange had been. One could imagine just how powerful the black-clothed people's opponents had been. There were still 2 figures standing on the cold, snowy river. One was that blue-clothed stranger Luo Bu had seen in Hanqiu City. His face was still covered in a bronze mask, making him seem abnormally terrifying. Even more terrifying was the qi exuded from his body. When the snowflakes falling from the sky and the cold wind blowing from the river approached his body, they would naturally avoid him. In a battle of this level, the blue-clothed stranger could not conceal his chi, much less his cultivation. Luo Bu slightly arched his brow, his right hand subconsciously gripping the sword at his waist. Even if he used his sword, he would still be no match for the blue-clothed man. But only by gripping his sword could he remain calm and ensure that he would not be discovered. The blue-clothed man was actually an expert of the divine domain. The hidden strength of the great Western continent had truly surpassed the conjectures of many people of the central continent. Even more shocking was that the blue-clothed man, despite his strength, was actually the loser in this morning's battle. A trickle of blood trickled down his shoulder, and a small piece of his bronze mask was missing. Just who could defeat an expert of the divine domain? On the other side of the river, that person was also wearing a blue gown, but it was lighter and plainer. He was not wearing a mask. He faced the wind, snow, and world with an indifferent expression. His eyebrows drooped, his shoulders somewhat slumped, making him seem very wretched. The wind and snow arrived in front of him, blowing incessantly. His sleeves moved slightly, but they were empty. 3 years ago, he had severed one of his arms. He used his remaining hand to grip a blade. The wind and snow curled around him, but he knew no fear. The flowing water beneath the snow had already been cut off. I didn't think that I would have the chance to experience Wang Po's path of the blade. The blue-clothed stranger spoke in a slightly hoarse voice. Wang Po calmly replied, I also didn't think that I would have the chance to witness the elegant bearing of an expert of the great Western continent. Chapter 8:18. The blue-clothed stranger had not expected Chen Changsheng to see through his background at a glance. After a moment of silence, he said, I didn't think that the level of the experts of the continent would be so high. When Guanshinka went to our side, he was far inferior to you, and Tai Shu was even more inferior. Could it be that your side is more suited for cultivation? The Guanshinka and Tai Shu he spoke of were both experts with deep ties to the great Western continent, and Tai Shu had originally been a person of the great Western continent. You and Tai Shu are old friends. Wang Po asked. The stranger replied, We truly are old acquaintances. Wang Po calmly looked at him and asked, You want to avenge him? The strange man in blue laughed, his voice still as hoarse as before. Avenge? Back then, I chased Tai Shu into the sea, but he was ultimately saved by Guanshinka. He wouldn't want me to avenge him, would he? In the Battle of the Capital 3 years ago, Tai Shu had died to Wang Po's blade that had broken through, but no one could deny Tai Shu's strength. In the great Western continent, Tai Shu had not yet broken through that threshold, but he was still an extremely talented expert. For him to be chased so miserably by this person meant that this person had an extremely high status and reputation in the great Western continent. Wang Po recalled this person's emotional sigh and said, It's not that the Central Plains is more suited for cultivation, but that there are many cultivators on our side, so the competition is inevitably fierce. The blue-clothed stranger thought for a moment, then said, That's reasonable. Then in your view, what is my current position in the Central Plains? Wang Po replied, You should be able to rank in the top 10. The continent was vast and filled with countless experts. For a grandmaster of the blade, like Wang Po, to personally affirm that this person could rank in the top 10 showed that this person was truly extraordinary. However, this sentence was only exchanged for a sigh from the strange man in cyan clothes. Only the top 10? The stranger sighed, content with a corner, peace and joy, in the end, is not the correct path of cultivation. One is certain to fall behind. Wang Po replied, Peace and joy is also what one wishes for. If one falls behind, one will be beaten, and if one closes oneself off, one will eventually decay. We should still return, the stranger said as he looked into Wang Po's eyes. Wang Po was quiet for a very long time, then said, I have no opinion on this matter. If the humans of the great Western continent wanted to return to the Central Plains, it would assuredly be a major event that would provoke many troubles and disputes. Even if only a small portion of the experts returned, they still needed territory and resources. But from Emperor Taizong to the Tianhai Divine Empress to the present, from the alliance with the demi-human race to the confluence of the North and South, to the union of the East and West, this was the general trend of events. Because in order to fight against the devil race, until the devil race was completely annihilated, humans must unite all their strength. After all, the people living in the great Western continent were all humans. In the view of many human experts, they were more trustworthy than the demi-humans of White Emperor City and should be closer to them. As for the demi-humans themselves, they might have been worried that the return of the great Western continent to the continent would affect their status. But now that their emperors came from the great Western continent, they probably wouldn't be too wary. There were very few people with the right to decide this matter. The emperor of the Great Zhou, the Pope, the Holy Maiden, the White Emperor couple, and now Shang Xingzhou. An expert like Wang Pa naturally had a certain right to speak. In the past, Wang Pa had supported this idea, but now his opinion had changed. It was obvious that Shang Xingzhou had used Madame Mu to form some sort of agreement with the great Western continent through Madame Mu. Whether it was the fact that Mu Jiushi had almost become the successor to the Pope, or that this divine domain expert of the great Western continent had led people to try and kill Shang Xingzhou. The standoff between the Great Zhou imperial court and the orthodoxy was growing more and more severe by the day, each staring at the other. It was already extremely difficult for the imperial court to stealthily dispatch true experts to kill the Pope, but the great Western continent was a power outside the original chessboard. If Chen Changsheng had really followed his original plan and followed the river, if Wang Pa had not come, the great Western continent really might have been able to kill him. Wang Pa could not accept such a thing. Since you have no opinion on this matter, why are you here? The blue-clothed stranger looked at him and said, "The orthodoxy was assuredly prepared and did not need you to take the lead. Or perhaps His Holiness the Pope wants to use this method to force you to state your position. Just because I don't have any thoughts doesn't mean that I don't have a stance. My stance has never changed." Wang Pa replied, "Back then, between Tianhai and the imperial clan, between the imperial court and Su Li, and now, between teacher and student, I have always maintained the correct position." The stranger in black asked, "What is correct?" Wang Pa replied, "His Holiness the Pope is a good person. What was the correct position? How could one determine right and wrong? It was originally just a simple matter of good and bad. But people would change, so how could one determine? If one could not look at a lifetime, then one could look at a moment. As long as one was good in this moment, it was enough. For example, the heavily injured Su Li in the snowy plains of the Demon Realm, or the heavily injured Chen Changsheng by Hai Di on the battlefield more than a year ago. None of them should have been treated in such a manner by their own world." After a moment of silence, the stranger asked, "What if it was the Tang clan that wanted to kill him?" Wang Pa recalled that snowstorm in the capital 3 years ago. He and Tai Shu had sat on opposite sides of the table, and the Tang second master had said 4 words. "Kindness is weighty as a mountain." So what? He had still struck the second master in the face with his blade sheath, and he had still used his blade to break the sheath and slash Tai Shu. Kindness as weighty as a mountain had to be repaid, but it was a different matter to demand repayment for kindness. The stranger understood his silence and shook his head. Back then, it was the Tang's second master. Now that he wants to enter Wenshui, you have to face the old master. Many years ago, Wang Pa had worked as an accountant in Wenshui for many years. The Tang old master had treated him like his own son, nurturing him. It had been many years since he had returned to Wenshui. So would he return this year? Just as the stranger had said, the entire continent wanted to know. If he really did return to Wenshui, just how would he face the old master? No matter how strong he was, no matter how firm his will, could he still raise his blade against the Tang old master? As he watched Wang Pa's figure vanish downstream, Luo Bu fell silent for a very long time. His fingers lightly moved through the winter-sweet flowers, making no sound. If it were him, he would also not know how to deal with this situation. The azure-robed stranger also left. Luo Bu left the riverbank and followed, maintaining a distance of around 2 or 3 li. This mysterious visitor from the great western continent was clearly an expert of the divine domain. Following him without alarming him was an extremely difficult task, even suicidal. But Luo Bu had no intention of stopping, because he wanted to find out the truth of this matter. Just like back then, for the sake of obtaining that key, he had braved enormous dangers to contend with the young experts of Shualao City for several months. And he was confident that he would not be discovered by the stranger. The two shores of the river were covered in dead winter grass, covered in frost. It was very similar to the grass around Sloping Cliff Horse Farm, looking like countless swords piled together. As he walked through the frost grass, he seemed to become one with his surroundings because he was also a sword. Chapter 819. There were many swordsmen in the world, but when it came to cultivation in the path of the sword, a normal person would believe that Chen Changsheng was the highest. This was because Chen Changsheng had learned countless sword styles, had countless swords, and had even learned the sword from Su Li. In truth, although Luo Bu did not know as many sword styles as Chen Changsheng, his cultivation in the path of the sword was definitely not below Chen Changsheng's, and might even be slightly superior. After some time, the snowy river suddenly broke. This was an extremely precipitous part of the river, a drop of tinsome zhang from top to bottom. Ice and snow covered the plains and the river, and where the river broke, the water beneath the layer of ice surged out with a roar. The blue-clothed stranger walked to a massive rock in the middle of the river. The water was like a waterfall, mixed with chunks of ice and snow as it poured down the sides of the rock. Mu Jiushi sat at the very front of the rock, gazing at the dirty and somewhat muddy water, her thoughts inscrutable. The blue-clothed stranger and Mu Jiushi exchanged a few words. Luo Bu concealed himself in the frost grass and quietly watched. He was too far away and the sound of the water was too loud, making it impossible for him to clearly hear what the two were talking about, but he could draw this scene. The charcoal brush moved across the white paper, softly grinding against each other. Very quickly, the snowy river, the chaotic waterfall, and the two people on the rock appeared. The blue-clothed stranger suddenly turned around and glanced at the forest by the river. Luo Bu's hand, holding the charcoal brush, was somewhat stiff. After leaving the desert, Chen Changsheng continued his journey to Wenshui City. However, he now had Nank with him, as well as Zhuxiu and Guanfei Bai. He was keenly aware that the road to the south was assuredly fraught with problems, and once he entered Wenshui City, he would encounter even more problems. Neither he nor Zhuxiu had said why they were going to Wenshui. Just like back then, after defeating Zhou Ziheng outside the Orthodox Academy, he had boarded a carriage and headed for the alley of the Northern Military Department. At the time, he and that fellow had also not said what they were going to do. At the time, they were going to Zhou prison to pick up someone. Now it was the same. They were going to Wenshui City to pick up someone. It had been a very long time since there had been any news of that fellow in Wenshui City. Regardless of whether the people he encountered on the road really dared to assassinate Chen Changsheng, many people did not want him to go to Wenshui. So he had to go to Wenshui. Winter of the third year of Xian country. On a very ordinary and unremarkable day, the winter clouds suddenly dispersed and the sun shone brightly. Chen Changsheng's party arrived at the plains outside of Wenshui City. When he could see Wenshui City in the distance, Wenshui City had already seen him. It could be said with great certainty that at this point, all of Wenshui City knew that he had come. But nothing happened. Whether it was the Tang family guards at the city gates or the peddlers and pedestrians they saw along the way, none of them revealed any strange emotions when they saw them. To be more precise, the guards and peddlers didn't even look at them, including the customs documents. Wenshui City was very flourishing. The streets and alleys were interconnected and extended in all directions, especially the main street that passed through the city from the north to the south. It was not the slightest bit inferior to the capital's Vermilion Bird Avenue or Luoyang's Great Avenue of the East God. It could accommodate 8 carriages abreast, and it was extremely spacious and imposing. But when Chen Changsheng and the others appeared, the streets suddenly seemed a little crowded. It was not that they deliberately blocked the footsteps of those vehicles and pedestrians, but that those vehicles and pedestrians began to change lanes when they were about 100 feet away from them. It was very obvious that the pedestrians and vehicles were circling around them, or perhaps avoiding them from a distance. They were like a massive rock in a river, squeezing the water to the sides. Other than a few curious children at the mouth of the alleys, no one else even glanced at them, but they also kept their distance, as if they were scourges and ferocious beasts. The atmosphere was very strange. Chun Chong Sheng even had the feeling that even the fragrances wafting out of those restaurants did not dare to approach them. Zhishio silently gazed at that building with white walls and black eaves at the end of the street. That building was still very far from them, but that ancient aura of history was already assaulting their senses. That place was the world-renowned ancestral hall of the Tang clan. It was said that it had an even longer history than the imperial palace of the capital. Guan Feibai was also looking at that building, his right thumb, index finger, and middle finger slowly stroking the rather old hilt of his sword. His eyes were slightly narrowed, seemingly thinking about something. If the news from Li Palace was correct, that fellow should be imprisoned there. Nank was not thinking about anything. She used 2 fingers to pull at Chun Chong Sheng's sleeve. She just felt a little hungry and wanted to eat meat. Chun Chong Sheng began to walk forward. The crowd very naturally parted, leaving the middle of the street as if a divine power had parted an ocean. Chun Chong Sheng did not walk to that building with white walls and black eaves at the end of the street. He stopped at a certain place, then turned and walked up the stone steps. Behind the stone steps was a quiet path. Deep within the path was a forest, and deep within the forest was a Taoist church. This was the Orthodoxy's church in Wenshui City. The door of the Taoist church slowly closed. Chun Chong Sheng and the others could no longer see it. The peddlers and pedestrians on the street suddenly stopped and looked at the tightly shut door of the Taoist church. In the silence, only the barking of dogs and the crying of children could be heard in the distance. This scene was even stranger, like one of those incomprehensible mimes in Xiulao City. After some time, the crowd withdrew their gazes from the Taoist church and continued forward, returning to their own lives. The door of the Taoist church was tightly shut. The snow-covered forest was silent. No one knew what was going on inside. Until dusk descended. The pedestrians on the street no longer looked at the Taoist church in the forest as if on purpose. But in other places, countless eyes were watching. The Wenshui flowed through the city. One section of the water was gentle and beautiful, and it happened to be behind the Taoist church. On the opposite shore, 7 peddlers, 6 government laborers, 3 fortune tellers, 2 sesame candy-selling elders, and 1 cosmetic-buying girl were constantly watching the rear garden of the Taoist church. There was also an officer with a full beard who would occasionally glance in that direction. The rays of the setting sun fell on the mirror-like water, transforming into countless balls of fire that seemed to burn the sky. Those rays of light then reflected back and fell on his face, and his beard seemed to turn into burning shrubs. Liu Obu recalled the Tang clan's famous 3 moves of Wenshui. These 3 sword techniques all had very pleasant names: gathering evening clouds, hanging sunset, and one stream of maples. Perhaps that virtuous predecessor of the Tang clan had seen this sort of scenery in this place and was inspired to create such a wondrous and beautiful sword style. The rear garden of the Taoist church was as quiet as usual, with not a single person to be seen. Suddenly, the sound of a zither could be heard, gurgling like water, very pleasant to the ears. He turned his head and saw a blind zither player sitting on the shore of the Wenshui, plucking at the zither strings. Although it was dusk, the rays of light from the west seemed even brighter and somewhat dazzling, but the blind zither player could not sense this. Unlike other people, he did not use his hands to block the light. Instead, he squinted his eyes and lightly swayed his head to and fro with the sound of the zither. He seemed to be in extreme enjoyment and intoxication. Seeing this, Luo Bu walked up to the zither player and threw down a few pieces of silver. The sound of the silver pieces falling made the zither player even happier. His eyebrows seemed about to fly up, and his fingers plucked at the strings even faster. But the style of the zither suddenly changed, becoming more and more subdued. It was no longer the thousands of golden leaves on the river, but the distant people of the city pass under the setting sun. It was once said that there were 10,000 pieces of gold coins on the surface of the water under the sun. This is an even more vulgar way of saying it, and I like reading his book, so I've been happily using it in the last few years. In Wenshui City, the richest place in the world of choosing the heavens, this way of saying it could not be more appropriate. Chapter 820. Luobu stood by the zither player's side and listened for a while, then suddenly began to sing along with the zither. The zither player was playing an obscure song, but the lyrics he was singing were extremely famous in the world. Moreover, his voice was extremely coarse and bold. Compared to the willows and snow of Wenshui City, it had a different flavor, instantly attracting the attention of many people. My sword comes from the west, your clothes flutter in the wind so small, and lovely flowing through the courtyard. I copy scriptures in the temple, and tomorrow I must practice the fist and change muscles. Spring mountain loves to smile tomorrow my road is even further the horse's hooves become butterflies bending the bow and shooting arrows. Walking through the green forest, I am that scholar who goes to the capital to take the exam, but does not study. I have come to Luoyang to see your reflection, the final brush in the water. The remains in the light of day sever your small thinness, say, a ladle of your small fullness. Note, when Rin, the Yellow River, the blind zither player played for a very long time, and Luobu sang for a very long time. More and more people gathered around the riverbank, and the pile of copper coins and silver fragments in front of the zither player grew larger and larger, glimmering with a delightful luster in the last glimmer of twilight. The twilight deepened until it became night. The shops and inns along the banks of the Wenshui began to light up, the lights falling into the water like stars. Suddenly, the crowd began to gasp in shock. Everyone's gazes left the blind zither player and Luobu and looked to the other shore. That was the rear garden of the Taoist church. Luobu arched his brows and turned to look. The Taoist church was glowing with light, the clouds slowly circling over its roof. They had already reached the highest point, and the elegant and dignified ceremonial music slowly began to play. This was a declaration. The Pope had come to Wenshui. The people on the riverbank once more stopped and quietly stood where they were, just like what had happened on the main street during the day. The 7 peddlers stopped yelling. The 6 government laborers lowered the chains in their hands. The 3 fortune tellers opened their eyes. The 2 sesame candy-selling elders used to wrap the candy in their hands to lightly tremble in the wind, and the face of the girl who bought cosmetics was snow white, as if she had already applied 5 layers of it. I didn't expect it to be a smart person. As he gazed at the boundless light on the other shore and listened to the ceremonial music from the church, Luobu thought, perhaps you have a smart person at your side. Wenshui City had an incomparably long history, and the Tang clan had an even longer history than the Chan Imperial clan and the Liang clan. As the head of the 4 great clans, the wealthiest clan in the world, the Wenshui Tangs controlled countless industries: transportation, armaments, foodstuffs, mines. As long as it was a truly important industry, one could always see the Tang clan's low-key figure that could not be ignored, and this established the Tang clan's position in the entire continent. Up until now, no one knew exactly what kind of power the Tang clan possessed, because up until now, no power had been able to force the Tang clan to use all of its power. So, when it came to the Tang clan, people could only use the most vague way to describe it, and that was their foundation. The resources were at the bottom, just like those uncountable water plants at the bottom of the Wenshui. The common people only knew that they were there, but they had never seen them with their own eyes. They could only imagine and guess, so the Tang clan became more and more mysterious, more and more terrifying. But there would always be some indirect proof. For instance, no one had ever dared to swim or fish in the Wenshui. For instance, whether it was Emperor Taizong or the later Tianhai Divine Empress with her monstrous power, they had always treated the Tang clan with a gentle and conciliatory attitude, because it was easy to drown in the Wenshui, and moving against the Tang clan would inevitably bring chaos to the world. Chun Changsheng was the current pope, the most revered individual on the continent, but not even he could do anything to the Tang clan. If he had revealed his identity after leaving the Mount Song army headquarters and wanted to come to Wenshui City, the Tang clan could have thought of countless ways to politely keep him out of the city. Thus, he could only conceal his identity and come to Wenshui City like an ordinary traveler, even if Wenshui City had long since known of his arrival. But now that he had entered Wenshui City, if he still wanted to act like he did a few days ago and attempt to secretly rescue Tang 36 from the Ancestral Hall, the Tang clan really might have made him disappear into the darkness of the Wenshui, because this was Wenshui. Thus, the Taoist church exploded with light and clouds streamed into the sky. He directly revealed his identity to all of Wenshui City. No matter how deep and serene the Wenshui was, no matter how terrifying the water grass at the bottom of the river, would they dare to do anything to him? This was a very simple and direct declaration, but in the view of Luo, Bu, and many people, including the Tang clan, it was brimming with wisdom. But in reality, this decision had little to do with Chun Changsheng. He was just acting according to the instructions in the letter. The reason the Taoist church had been so quiet for half a day was not because he was discussing matters with the others, but because he had other important matters to attend to. Lush green trees covered the entire place. In this cold winter, it was obvious that some sort of array within the Taoist church was constantly providing heat to the earth. Even in the capital's Li Palace, this was an excessively extravagant act. Only in Wenshui City did it seem very ordinary, because this city was truly far too wealthy. A quiet and winding stone path ran through the forest. Starting from noon, a bishop stood on either side of the stone path, spaced several zhang apart, their expressions humble and solemn. The deeper one went, the higher the rank of the bishops on either side of the stone path. By the time they reached the holy gate of the rear hall, there were even 4 cardinals standing there. A pear blossom was planted in the holy gate, and beneath the pear blossom was the gate to the rear hall. The Archbishop of Wenshui stood outside the gate. Several years ago, Chun Changsheng had come to Wenshui and lived in the rear hall. At the time, he had already been appointed principal of the Orthodox Academy by the Pope, and the entire continent knew that he would be the future Pope. The Archbishop naturally received him with great hospitality, but it had never been like today. To the Li Palace, Wenshui City was naturally the most important place, and the position of Archbishop was assuredly a cushy job. The orthodoxy had not been stable in the last few years, and for this archbishop to have served here for so many years, he was naturally no ordinary person. Yet he quietly waited outside the gate. Even as time passed, he did not reveal the slightest hint of impatience. He did not even move his feet. He seemed exceptionally humble, so humble that he was about to sink into the dust, because Chun Changsheng was already the pope. Although they clearly understood this fact, the cardinals did not dare to silently criticize the archbishop when they saw that he was being deliberately ignored. They could not help but feel somewhat uncomfortable. What comforted them a little was that Zheshio and Guan Feibai had also been barred from entering the rear hall and were currently in a daze in the forest. The wolf tribes Zheshio and Mount Li's Guan Feibai were naturally famous people, and their relationship with the Pope was also known to the entire world. If even they could not enter the hall, then there was no one else. Starting from noon, the gate to the rear hall had not been opened, and no sound came from within. No one knew what Chun Changsheng was doing inside. Only when the twilight was at its thickest did the forest by the river and the roof of the hall seem to simultaneously burn, and then a real heat was emitted. This was heat produced by real fire, not from the array beneath the Taoist church. The green leaves on the pear tree slightly curled up. The archbishop finally raised his head and gazed at the tightly shut gate, a nervous expression on his face. Chapter 8:21. Guan Feibai used his sleeve to wipe the sweat from his forehead, perhaps because of the heat or because he was nervous. This is refining the cinnabar pill. His voice was rather hoarse, but it was also very low, as he was worried that someone else would hear. Zheshio also did not know what was going on in the hall, but he had taken the cinnabar pill and knew its flavor, so he nodded. Upon receiving his confirmation, Guan Feibai gasped. In the snowy plains of the north, the cinnabar pill had been the most talked about this year. He naturally knew of this legendary divine medicine that could revive the dead and regrow bones. But he was not gasping in shock, but because he had confirmed the authenticity of that other rumor. The cinnabar pill had really been refined by Chun Changsheng. Had he really used his own blood? Half a year ago, a martial uncle of Mount Lisor Hall had fought a bloody battle with the 21st Demon General outside the Black Mountain Army headquarters. He had returned with a severed arm and blood on the verge of exhaustion. Even the sacred light technique had lost its effect, and in the final moment of danger, he had relied on a cinnabar pill to survive. When he thought of this, Guan Feibai truly did not know how to face Qin Changsheng. The door to the rear hall finally opened. A wave of heat surged out, causing the leaves on the pear trees to rustle and fall. It seemed like midsummer had arrived. Nang supported Qin Changsheng as they walked out. His face was rather pale, like he had just recovered from serious illness. The Archbishop of Wenshui hurriedly stepped forward to welcome him. Qin Changsheng handed the small porcelain bottle in his hand to him. The bottle naturally contained the incomparably precious cinnabar pill. Over the past year, Qin Changsheng would provide a bottle of cinnabar pills to the soldiers on the front lines every month. His blood was limited. Logically speaking, this month's supply of cinnabar pills should have been refined and distributed 10 some days ago, but he had been heavily injured by the Demon Lord in the snowy mountains and had lost a great deal of blood. Afterwards, he had spent the entire time recuperating in Sloping Cliff Horse Farm, so it was simply impossible for him to do so. He had never said anything, but he was actually rather anxious. He knew that in Blue Pass, Snow-Old Pass, Song Province, Black Mountain, and many other places, there were many heavily injured soldiers on the verge of death waiting for the cinnabar pill to appear. Those people were truly anxious. As a result, when he left Hanqiu City, he had already secretly sent a message to Wenshui, having the Taoist church on this side prepare the appropriate ingredients. Now that he had arrived in Wenshui, he could no longer care about the fact that his injuries had not completely healed and immediately began to refine the medicine. Now that the bottle of cinnabar pills had been refined, the next step was naturally to deliver it to the army headquarters. At the very beginning, this matter had been handled by the Orthodoxy's Hall of Illustrious Persons, but later on, it was handed over to the Tang clan. He was currently in Wenshui, but he had no intention of continuing to hand the matter over to the Tang clan. This was because everything that had happened that night in the mountains had been instigated by the Tang clan, and the Tang clan clearly did not care about the goodwill he had displayed through the cinnabar pill. Qin Changsheng said, "Send someone to deliver it overnight to Hanqiu City and find the manager of Scholartree Manor. They know how to distribute it." It was very quiet. The Archbishop did not reply, nor did he intend to take the small porcelain bottle. It was not that he dared to disobey the imperial edict, or that he was weighing the pros and cons, but that he was too shocked. There were several important pieces of information in this sentence, one of which was bound to shake the entire continent. Wang Per returned to Tianliang County. Regardless of whether he had returned or not, since Scholartree Manor had arrived, he had also arrived. Everyone knew that Scholartree Manor was Wang Per. But what truly shocked the Archbishop was not this piece of information, but the small porcelain bottle itself. Sending someone to deliver it overnight to Hanqiu City was enough time for him to tamper with it, if he wanted to. The Archbishop's complexion constantly fluctuated, sometimes red, sometimes white, and finally calm. He extended his hand and took the small porcelain bottle, not even the slightest trembling. "I will definitely not disappoint your Holiness's trust." Zhishio looked at Qin Changsheng's paper-pale complexion and said, "The blood can regenerate itself, but for a long time, it will have a major effect on cultivation." Qin Changsheng replied, "I eat many spiritual fruits and earth ginseng every day, so it won't be too big of a problem." Zhishio replied, "If you want to become a saint, it will be a major problem." Qin Changsheng fell silent, not replying. Zhishio stared into his eyes and asked, "Did she not stop you?" Qin Changsheng knew that the she he spoke of was not Su Yurong, Nor was it the owner of the letter, but the little black dragon. As he thought of that intense quarrel at the start, he chuckled. Zhishio said, "Compared to saving those people, your own strength is even more important to this world." Chun Chongqing's gaze paused on the pear tree outside the door for a few moments. Then he said, "I understand this principle, but if I had never thought of this matter at the start, then it would have been fine. But now, I clearly know that I only need to bleed a little every month to save several dozen lives. Yet I don't do this. It really is very difficult." Guan Feibai, who had remained silent all this time, said, "That's reasonable. If it were me, I would also find it difficult." Zhishio had grown up in the harsh and cruel wastelands, so he found it impossible to understand the thoughts of these disciples of the righteous sects of the South. He shook his head and said no more. "While you were refining medicine, the Taoist church already announced your arrival to Wenshui." Guan Feibai turned to Chen Changsheng and said, "What I don't understand is that even if you reveal your identity and the Tang clan no longer dares to touch you, what method do you have to save Tang Tang? Even if you personally pay a visit, they won't let you see them, so what can you do? Not even the Pope can break into the ancestral hall." "I also don't know. Tomorrow, I'll see how it goes." Chen Changsheng glanced at the night sky and saw the many stars. Tomorrow would probably be a sunny day. The day was sunny and warm, but the night was windy. The winter wind blowing from the mountains of the north followed the Wenshui into the city and lingered around the Taoist church. The pear tree swayed and green leaves fell. It seemed rather desolate, as if foreshadowing a change in the weather. On the morning of the next day, the change came. It was not a sudden shower of snow, nor was it a dazzling wind. Instead, it was the rumble of countless peals of thunder. Hooves thundered, the morning light shattered, the earth quaked, the plains uneasy, and Wenshui city began to sound the alarm. The city gate that had not been closed for several centuries began to close with unimaginable speed. All sorts of divine city garrison crossbows on the city walls turned and aimed at the plains to the north. Countless somber and powerful qis began to seep out, indicating that countless arrays were beginning to operate within the city gate, within the city walls, and even underground. Just by looking at the number of divine city garrison crossbows, the density of the arrays, and the flying carriages flying through the air, one could tell that Wenshui city's defensive capabilities were extremely powerful, so powerful that they had severely surpassed the norm. They were not one bit inferior to Luoyang. What was even more frightening was that regardless of whether it was the soldiers at the city gate, the Tang family guards who reacted even faster, or the most ordinary peddlers and pawns, even though they were frightened by the thunderous hoofbeats in the distance to the point that their expressions changed greatly, they still did not panic. They followed the order and quickly retreated into the city. It was obvious that although Wenshui city had not faced the calamity of war in the past countless years, it had never forgotten to fight. Putting aside the Tang clan's unfathomable resources, just this sturdy city and its well-trained soldiers and civilians would make anyone who attacked it pay a grievous price. Even the bloodiest, cruelest, and most ruthless of the demon wolf cavalry would not dare to charge over in a single breath. They would assuredly stop outside the range of those several hundred divine crossbows. As expected, the thunderous hooves gradually stopped, and the black tide stopped on the plains 1,000 zhang away. Chapter 822. The black tide stopped on the distant plains. Even the Tang clan's special monoculars found it very difficult to make out the origins of these cavalry. It didn't take long before 100-some cavalry left the ranks and galloped toward Wenshui city, completely ignoring the divine crossbows on the walls. Even though they had practiced this countless times, the soldiers and Tang clan guards still grew nervous at this sight. After all, they had never had any real experience. Accompanied by his subordinates, the city lord hurried to the top of the walls. His clothes were not even properly dressed, much less his armor. As he gazed at the distant tide of cavalry and the approaching 100-some cavalry, the city lord's face grew paler and paler. He saw that the 100-some cavalry had already entered the range of the divine crossbows, but he did not dare to give the order to attack. Sweat poured out his body. He turned to the Tang clan guards and yelled in panic. Where's the master? Why hasn't anyone from the master come? The imperial court had personally appointed the lord of Wenshui city, but he was well aware that he would never be the master of this city. From countless years ago, the master of this city had only had one surname, the Tang clan. Some time had passed since the alarm had sounded. No matter how slow the response, the people from the Tang clan should have arrived by now. Why was it that there were only those guards on the walls and not a single important figure of the Tang clan? An advisor stared at the approaching hundred-some cavalry and thought of a possibility. He whispered, "There's no sign of activity from the master, which means that he's definitely fine." The city lord felt that these words were very reasonable. Wiping the cold sweat from his face, he asked in a trembling voice, "Then just who has come?" As time passed, the hundred-some cavalry arrived in front of Wenshui city. There was no battle because the people on the walls very quickly knew who they were. The ones who had come to Wenshui city were not the Demon Expeditionary Army, but 2,000 papal cavalry. Their mission was to escort the 3 Sacred Hall archbishops into Wenshui city. The 3 Sacred Hall archbishops had come to Wenshui city for an even simpler reason, to serve the Pope. No matter how unhappy the soldiers and civilians of Wenshui city were with this sudden disturbance, they had no reason to keep them out of the city. The vast majority of the 2,000 papal cavalry remained on the plains, showing no hostility. The heavy city gate, which had just been closed not long ago, slowly opened. Escorted by 100 cavalry, the 2 carriages entered Wenshui city under the gaze of countless complicated gazes. Archbishop and Lin exchanged a few words with the city lord through the curtains. She had no intention of leaving the carriage. Some of the people on the street looked curiously at the figure in the carriage, while others knelt down and prayed piously. Linghai Zhuang and Daoist Baisher were still sitting in the same carriage. The Tang family's reaction is very fast. It won't be easy to attack. Linghai Zhuang expressionlessly said as his gaze passed through the curtain and fell upon the Tang clan guards on the distant wall, who were clearly not soldiers of the imperial court. There were many deep meanings hidden in these words. Daoist Baisher smiled and said nothing. Linghai Zhuang glanced at him and said, "Wenshui city has never seen the fires of war. So why is the Tang clan so vigilant and careful, even going so far as to set up a divine crossbow array and raise so many private soldiers? Could it be that they want to rebel?" The meaning of these words was even more clear. Daoist Baisher's smile faded, but he still didn't say anything because he didn't know how to respond. 2,000 Orthodoxy cavalry escorted the 3 prefects of the Orthodoxy to Wenshui city. Their reason was very sufficient, because they wanted to ensure the Pope's safety. No one could say anything, but no one could forget the crux of this matter. The Li Palace had not notified Wenshui city beforehand. To take without asking was to steal. To arrive without asking was to ambush. 2,000 Orthodoxy cavalry suddenly appeared outside Wenshui city, their thunderous hooves tearing through the morning light. Although nothing happened, all of Wenshui city felt nervous and uneasy that morning. 1,000 years ago, the demon army had invaded the south and surrounded Luoyang for a very long time. Their vanguard was only 300-some li from the capital, but they had never reached Wenshui city. Looking even further back in history, in the chaotic era when heroes vied for hegemony, the continent was covered in the flames of war, the populace destitute, and the land for 1,000 li was scorched. Only Wenshui city had not suffered any attack. It quietly watched the turmoil of the world. In countless years, this was the first time that Wenshui city had seen an army. Just what did the Orthodoxy mean by doing this? Was it a demonstration against the Tang clan and the imperial court? Was it worried about the Pope's safety? Or did it want to intimidate some people in Wenshui city? As the imperial envoy, the Prince of Zhongshan did not immediately return to the capital after leaving the Mount Song army headquarters. Instead, he represented the emperor in inspecting the northern armies. When he received this news, he was at Blue Pass. The first question he thought of was not this, but that the people of the Orthodoxy had not gone to Song province. On that day, Linghai Zhuang and the other two prefects of the Orthodoxy had led 2,000 Orthodoxy cavalry to attack the Mount Song army headquarters with a thunderous momentum. Using the assassination of the Pope, they had forcefully seized the position of divine general of the Mount Song army headquarters. A large part of this was because their arrival had been too sudden. Those 2,000-some Orthodoxy cavalry had been stationed on the perimeter of Xuanyang City the entire time. The road to the Mount Song army headquarters was mostly through the wilderness, so it was understandable that they had been able to hide from the imperial court. The problem was that no one in the capital knew when those three prefects of the Orthodoxy had left the Li Palace. The imperial court naturally would not permit such a thing to happen again. After the three prefects of the Orthodoxy left the Mount Song army headquarters with their 2,000-some Orthodoxy cavalry, their whereabouts had always been under the control of the Great Zhou army. Everyone knew that they were currently advancing towards the Song province army headquarters. This was also something that many people in the court had predicted. The Orthodoxy had mobilized such a large force of forces, but it was naturally not just for the position of the Mount Song army headquarters. The Song province army headquarters was located to the west, and the conditions there were arduous, but it was also extremely important. Crucially, this was where Xue Xingchuan had risen to power. Even though he had been dead for 3 years, and the imperial court had carried out many purges, it was still impossible to completely remove his influence. From every angle, the Song province army headquarters should have been the Orthodoxy's next target. Who could have expected that 3 prefects of the Orthodoxy and 2,000 Orthodoxy cavalry would actually traverse that lifeless Rocky Mountain desert overnight and suddenly appear outside Wenshui City? Just what did the Orthodoxy want to do? Had the young pope really gone crazy and was preparing to massacre Wenshui? The Prince of Zhongshan finally began to ponder these matters, his expression growing colder and colder. He simply could not believe such an absurd theory, because he was very sure that the young pope would never do such a thing. And 2,000 cavalry wanted to massacre Wenshui? This was far too low of the Pope's intelligence and the unfathomable strength of the Tang clan. At this moment, cheers suddenly came from the street outside the army headquarters. The Prince of Zhongshan slightly creased his brow and asked, "What's the matter?" After a while, the cheers outside the headquarters showed no signs of stopping. On the contrary, they grew louder and louder, as if all of Blue Pass was celebrating something. Divine General Jian, she walked into the military hall and said in a slightly heavy voice, "I've just received news that the new batch of cinnabar pills will be distributed tomorrow." The Prince of Zhongshan's eyes grew deeper and deeper. He thought to himself, I don't know how intelligent the Pope is, but his bearing is truly extraordinary. Wenshui was one of the few ancient cities in the world. In the depths of winter, the snow and yellow leaves contrasted against each other, making the scenery seem even more serene and serene. Anyone who saw the mottled and ancient walls, those banners that had endured centuries of wind and rain, will be able to sense the heavy history behind them. When they thought of that noble clan in the city, this heavy sense of history would add a tinge of vicissitudes and power. Even Linghai Zhuang was not as irritable as he usually was after entering the city. He had become rather taciturn. He raised the curtain and first saw those people standing or kneeling on the street, and then he saw the gleam of water. Wenshui City was farther north than the capital, but the famed river that ran through the city had not frozen over even in the depths of winter, as if it had an inexhaustible source. Only the frost-stained grass on the riverbank and 2 or 3 little yellow flowers that had clearly frozen to death proved the principle that time could not be reversed. Outside the Taoist church, the carriage stopped. Linghai Zhuang followed the stone steps through the forest, Taoist Baisher and Archbishop Enlin following behind him. At the end of the quiet and secluded stone steps was the holy gate to the rear hall. A pear tree was planted in the gate, and a young man stood beneath the tree. Linghai Zhuang did not like this young man. He had never liked him. Even though he later learned of his identity as a legitimate successor of the Orthodoxy, he still found it impossible to understand why the Pope, whom he respected so dearly, had appointed him as his successor. In his view, Although this young man could not be considered cowardly, he still lacked a sharp edge. He was lifeless and uninteresting. No interest meant no love or hate, and without intense love or hate, one would not understand what responsibility was. Only now, when he saw the figure beneath the pear tree, did he vaguely understand something. It was not lifeless. It was calm and tranquil. This young man was like a small stream. The stream was somewhat shallow, but it was very clear. It was possible to see the fish swimming at the bottom and each person. The stream seemed very weak, but it was also very tenacious. Not even the sharpest sword could cut through it. The stream seemed very calm, but it actually contained an unimaginably surging energy that could cleave apart mountains and split the earth, flowing west to the sea. Just like Wenshui City. Everyone knew that he should not have come, or that it was inconvenient for him to come, but he still came. Linghai Zhuang finally understood the Pope's choice. He calmly prostrated. Taoist Bai Shi and Enlin glanced at each other, their expressions a little surprised, and then they also prostrated. The young man turned around and said, "Rise." A cool breeze blew, and countless tiny white flowers fell from the tree, sprinkling over his body and shoulders. They looked like fresh snow, incomparably clean. There were white flowers everywhere, falling all over the ground. It was currently the cold depths of winter, so why was there such a beautiful scene? Perhaps it was because he had been refining pills in the Taoist church yesterday, but the garden had suddenly warmed and vitality gradually flourished. Thus, it was like a spring breeze had suddenly come, and the pear trees had all bloomed. The 5th volume, The End of the Yellow Flowers of the Battlefield. Chapter 823. Linghai Zhuang bowed to Chun Chongsheng beneath the pear tree, then stood up. The entire process had been very swift. Compared to normal circumstances, he had stood up a little too quickly. It could be interpreted as his movements being concise, but it could also be interpreted as him not being attentive. Many people, especially the important figures of the Li Palace, knew that Linghai Zhuang had never liked the Pope and harbored a faint hostility towards him. Taoist Bai Shi and Enlin saw this out of the corner of their eyes, but they were not surprised. Linghai Zhuang had stood up while Taoist Bai Shi and Enlin were still bowing. There was a difference in height between the two sides. It was just like the difference between the pear blossoms on the tree and Chun Chongsheng. A cool breeze blew, and countless white flowers drifted down, landing on Chun Chongsheng's head or shoulders. Linghai Zhuang's right hand also drifted down, heading for Taoist Bai Shi's head. The cold wind howled, the trees swayed, and the pear blossoms danced. The wind even affected the distant Wenshui, throwing the shadows of the sky into chaos. The water grass at the bottom of the water fiercely swayed, seeming to transform into countless snakes. Linghai Zhuang's attack had been so sudden that no one in front of the hall could react, and Lin could only see the lightning-fast palm out of the corner of her eyes. She was abnormally shocked and wanted to stop it, but it was already too late. Yet Taoist Bai Shi seemed to have been prepared for this. He still maintained his prostrating posture, but his right palm had left the ground at some point. Like duckweed on the surface of the water being blown about by the wind, it began to flip. With a light clap, the two palms met above Taoist Bai Shi's head. The stone floor in front of the hall began to tremble, sinking down by several inches. The divine gate creaked in the howling wind, seeming ready to collapse at any moment. Linghai Zhuang's body swayed, and he took 2 steps back. Countless strands of pure qi leaked out of his divine robe, tearing countless cracks in the air. Taoist Bai Shi stood up, his face turning a deep red, as if countless drops of blood were about to seep out of his skin. And Lin was even more shocked, as the result of this clash of palms had completely exceeded her expectations. Linghai Zhuang and Taoist Bai Shi had similar cultivations, both at the peak of star condensation. Even if Taoist Bai Shi had been on guard this entire time, Linghai Zhuang's palm had been extremely sudden, perfectly conforming to the laws of the world in front of the hall. It could be said to be the strongest attack of his life, yet was unable to heavily injure Taoist Bai Shi, only gaining a slight advantage. Why was this? and Lin sensed the divine aura emanating from Taoist Whitestone's body and thought of a certain possibility. Her face paled. Taoist Baisher did not bleed, but he knew that Ling Haiji Wang's sinister and all-out sneak attack had still inflicted significant injuries. He had to immediately leave. He knew these people very well. This was their last chance to leave. Ling Haiji Wang needed time to recover the vibrations of his true essence. And Lin had only just awoken from her daze and had not yet begun to fight. The young man who had just walked out of the hall, his body brimming with fierce sword intent, was presumably a young expert of the Mount Li Sword sect. However, the Mount Li Sword sect was not skilled in the art of pursuit, so they should not be able to stop him. As for that person, he glanced at Chen Changsheng under the pear tree and thought, "You're still heavily injured. Even if you used 10,000 swords, how can you stop me?" With a cold snort, he suddenly sped up, transforming into a wisp of smoke in the winter sun as he rushed out of the Taoist church. As the fastest and most secretive of the prefects of the orthodoxy, his calculations had not been wrong. At this moment, no one present could stop him. But he did not know one thing. From the Mount Song Army headquarters to Wenshui City, Chen Changsheng had been accompanied by 2 other people. The wisp of smoke passed through the green trees of the garden, but it was never able to leave. No matter where he went, a girl would always appear in front of him. Taoist Baisher was forced to reveal himself. He looked at the girl in front of him, his eyes brimming with shock. This girl had a childish face and a dull look in her eyes, as if she could not think. "Then how did you know where I would go next? And how did you move so quickly?" What made him even more uneasy was that when he was flying through the forest, he had felt a cold wind at the back of his neck. It was like someone had been following him the entire time. He knew that he had to use his full strength. A divine chi emerged from his Taoist robe, and countless rays of pure white light seeped out of his palm. It was a perfectly round white stone. Anyone who had been to the heaven lake of Mount Han might be able to recognize that it was a heaven stone. This heaven stone was inlaid with an extremely complex array of black and gold. It was extremely beautiful and could be described as the pinnacle encounter between man and nature. This was one of the orthodoxy's treasures, the falling star stone. And Lin's conjecture was confirmed by this sight, causing her to become abnormally angry. Taoist Baisher had been able to preserve the majority of his strength against Ling Haiji Wang's all-out sneak attack precisely because of the falling star stone in his palm. The falling star stone was one of the orthodoxy's treasures controlled by Taoist Baisher. And Ling Haiji Wang, and the others also had one. These treasures, comparable to divine artifacts, were an important part of the Li Palace's array and were extremely important to the orthodoxy. Unless the Pope issued a decree, no one, including the prefects of the orthodoxy who were in charge of these treasures, could take these treasures out of the Li Palace. Taoist Baisher had secretly taken the falling star stone with him. No matter what his intentions were, he was guilty of betraying the orthodoxy. And Lin waved her right hand. Her belt flew off her body, bringing with it countless pear blossoms that surrounded Taoist Baisher. "Do you think that you can keep me here like this?" Taoist Baisher shouted at the girl in front of him. In truth, he was also saying these words to the ghostly figure behind him, to Enlin, and even more to Chen Changsheng. As he spoke, he smashed the falling star stone into the ground. Enlin cursed at this sight. Ignoring the fact that her belt had failed to form an array, she rushed into the forest. The falling star stone landed on the ground, but it made no sound. The petals and leaves did not even tremble. An ancient energy that seemed to come from an ancient era suddenly appeared. Countless cold winds poured into the falling star stone, and the petals and leaves on the ground followed it. The falling star stone seemed to transform into a massive vortex, swallowing up everything it touched. Even the laws of the world around it began to twist. An incomparably deep black hole appeared on the ground. It seemed to have a circumference of only 1 zhang, but it also seemed boundless. The falling star stone floated within, exuding a gloomy light as if it were a real star. The wind, the flowers, and the leaves continued to sink in and then vanish. "Stop him!" Enlin hurriedly yelled. The falling star stone was truly worthy of being a treasure of the orthodoxy that was comparable to a divine artifact. It had actually forcefully torn open space and opened a path that led to some unknown place. Taoist Baisher expressionlessly glanced at her. At this time, the falling star stone had already released its full aura. Whether it was the little girl in front of it or the ghostly figure behind it, none of them could stop it. He walked into the gloomy path. If nothing unexpected happened, he would appear several hundred li away in the next moment, on a plain. However, something unexpected happened at this moment. His feet had clearly landed in the gloomy path, so why did he still feel like he was stepping on dirt? Why did he feel like he was stepping on petals and leaves? Chapter 824. Taoist Baisher revealed a shocked expression as he looked around. He was still outside the Taoist church in the forest. The girl was still in front of him, that cold chi still at the back of his neck. What was going on? The falling star stone had clearly broken through space, so why was he still here? Taoist Baisher looked down at his feet, his face suddenly paling. The falling star stone continued to quietly float in the black space. However, the black space was shrinking at a speed visible to the naked eye. A divine power that came from an unknown place was constantly beating the black space like water waves. The falling star stone's distortion of the laws of the world had completely lost its effect. The petals and leaves no longer sank, but remained where they were. Just like how he could not enter that path and could only remain where he was. Where did this ripple-like power come from? Why was it so divine and dignified? Why could not even the falling star stone endure it? Taoist Baisher suddenly turned around, his gaze following the ripples on the ground into the distance. Ultimately, it rested behind the holy gate, beneath the pear tree. Chun Changsheng calmly stood beneath the pear tree, calmly looking at him as if completely unconcerned that he would escape. He gripped a divine staff in his hand. This was the staff that represented the orthodoxy's most divine will. The base of the divine staff was very shallow in the earth, but it was firm and unshakable. Countless strands of divine chi, with the divine staff as the center, spread out into the surroundings of the Taoist church like ripples. The petals and leaves of the forest slowly floated up. Once they were 3 feet above the ground, they no longer continued to rise. The water grass at the bottom of the river slowly floated up. Once they were 3 feet above the water, they no longer clung to the sunlight. Movement and stillness had an incomparably harmonious beauty. The pinnacle of beauty was solemnity. The sea of stars was solemnity, and solemnity was divinity. The entire Taoist church, the surrounding forest, and the river had transformed into a sea of stars. Any divine energy that encountered this sea of stars would become a part of it, drown or intoxicated, until it disappeared or coexisted with it. The falling star stone was a precious treasure of the orthodoxy, the fruit of the wisdom of countless generations of sages of the Li Palace. How could it possibly have the will to fight against the Pope's divine staff? Taoist White Stone could clearly sense that the falling star stone was separating from his Tao heart. Finally understanding the reason behind it, his face grew even paler. At this moment, the experts of the orthodoxy had gathered. Even if he had the falling star stone, he could only think about how to escape. If even the falling star stone was taken away, how could he still have the luck to escape? He couldn't care so much any longer and forcefully severed the connection between him and the meteor rock, and he endured the injuries brought about by the backlash of the divine Tao. He swallowed the mouthful of sweet blood before circulating his true essence madly, and he pushed his Tao arts to the limit before passing by the young girl at an oblique angle and transforming into a gale that flashed out of the forest. Enlin flicked her finger, and the belt fluttered in the wind, bringing with it countless flower petals that dazzled the eyes. Taoist Baisher was not blinded, but his vision was obscured. More importantly, the belt and the countless petals seemed to have changed the position of the forest. When the petals scattered, Taoist Baisher did not see the stone steps leading out of the forest, but Linghai Jiwang's callous face. After Linghai Jiwang succeeded in his sneak attack, He quietly retreated and did not attack again, waiting until now. He would not give Taoist Baisher another chance. He waved the metal ruler in his hand, which he had been accumulating energy for a long time, and smashed it at Taoist Baisher behind the pedals. Countless stars seemed to light up on the black iron ruler at this moment. There was a dull thud. The metal ruler broke through Taoist Baisher's defense and fiercely struck his shoulder. His shoulder bone instantly snapped in two, and his ethereal palace was shaken. Unable to control it any longer, he vomited blood into the air. Just when he was prepared to explode with his true essence and break through Linghai Jiwang, he suddenly felt a chill at his waist. He was very familiar with this chill, so he found it very frightening. Previously, this chill had been following him the entire time like a ghost was constantly blowing at his neck. Now, this chill had arrived at his waist. There was an extremely soft thud. It was just like that extremely cliché. A leather pouch filled with wine had been pierced through. The tip of a sword had pierced through Taoist Baisher's abdomen. The tip of this sword was not sharp. On the contrary, it seemed to have been chopped off by a sharp weapon, and its surface was covered with a few very complicated designs and patterns. After being dyed red with blood, these designs and patterns appeared particularly monstrous. Logically speaking, a supreme expert like Taoist Baisher should still be able to fight even if his abdomen was pierced by a sword. But for some reason, he suddenly became extremely weak, as if the sword carried countless strands of demon chi that were constantly devouring his life. Taoist Baisher lowered his head to his abdomen to that sword. Shock appeared in his blank eyes as he let out a cry of pain and despair. He had seen this sword in the pictures of the Taoist scriptures. He recognized this sword, the demon commander's banner sword that had disappeared for several centuries. Divine might like the sea. The iron ruler was like a mountain. The demon sword was like a banner. No matter how valiant Taoist Baisher was, he was finally unable to endure these three terrifying attacks. He vomited blood and half knelt on the ground, giving up all resistance. He raised his head with difficulty and realized that the girl was still standing in front of him. Her expression wouldn't. From start to finish, this girl had not attacked, but no matter where he went, she would always appear in front of him. This sort of not attacking was even more terrifying than attacking. Who was this girl? How could she possess such terrifying speed and movement techniques? Taoist Baisher stared at her face and suddenly thought of a possibility. An expression of disbelief appeared in his eyes as he turned towards the divine gate and harshly yelled, "You actually dare to bring her with you?" Chen Changsheng did not answer. Putting away the divine staff, he softly expressed his thanks to Guan Feibai. From the moment Linghai Jiwang launched his sneak attack, Guan Feibai had no idea what had happened, but he had subconsciously stood in front of Chen Changsheng and gripped the hilt of his sword. Because he knew that Chen Changsheng was still heavily injured and had lost too much blood, so he needed to be protected. At this moment, he vaguely understood something, and the hand gripping the hilt of his sword began to tremble. All of this had happened far too suddenly. Even someone like him, whose sword intent was as steady as a mountain, could not help but feel nervous when he suddenly realized that he had personally participated in a major affair of the orthodoxy. Enlin heard Taoist Baisher's words and faintly understood. She turned to the wooden girl, wanting to say something but hesitating. Linghai Jiwang had assuredly also guessed, but he was utterly unaffected by Taoist Baisher's words. He impassively asked, "Since you guessed that we had already discovered you, you still dared to follow us into the city. Was it the venerable Taoist or the Tang clan that guaranteed your safety? Or did you think that with the falling star stone in hand, you could do whatever you wanted?" The front of Taoist Baisher's robe was covered in blood, and he looked rather wretched, but his attitude remained unyielding. He sternly said, "I truly did not expect that the divine staff could suppress the falling star stone. It seems like this is the method the Pope uses to control the 6 halls. But so what? You can't just kill me on the spot, can you?" Chapter 825. P.S. Once you're done, don't be in such a hurry to play. Remember to first cast a monthly vote. From now on, you can enjoy double the monthly votes for the 515 Fan Festival, And you can also take a look at the other activities that give out red envelopes. He was the Archbishop of the Hall of Literary Splendor, an extremely revered status in the Orthodoxy. According to the laws of the Taoist canon, even if an important figure of his level violated the laws of the Church and was to be punished, the Pope should hold a general assembly in the Great Hall of Light, announce the charges in front of the crowd, and then have the Hall of Drifting Clouds condemn him. This was what the Pope had done when he expelled Mu Jiushi from the Li Palace. The current Pope, Chen Changsheng, had not returned to the capital for 3 years. Even if he returned to the capital to discuss Taoist Baisher's punishment, there might still be people in the Orthodoxy who would stand on Taoist Baisher's side, or at the very least request that he be exempted from the death penalty. And this wasn't even considering that Shang Xingzhou was in the capital. How could he just watch as Taoist Baisher died? Chen Changsheng did not make any evaluation of Taoist Baisher's words. He only calmly looked at him and asked why. He had already left the capital for 3 years, and the Li Palace was under immense pressure. Even though the Grass Moon Hall, the Moss Institute, and the other 5 halls had sealed their halls, they could not prevent this pressure from seeping in with the wind. After the confluence of the North and South, the Great Zhou Imperial Court began to flourish. Crucially, Shang Xingzhou had always been a legitimate successor of the Orthodoxy, a true saint. After the Pope and Archbishop Mei Lisha returned to the Sea of Stars, no one in the entire Orthodoxy could be found with more seniority and experience than him. Even Pope Chen Changsheng was a student. In these circumstances, how could a few people in the Orthodoxy not have other thoughts? He had originally believed that the person most likely to be able to worship his master was Taoist Siyuan or Linghai Zhuang, as there was an old grudge between them. He had not expected it to be Taoist Baisher. After all, Taoist Baisher had been one of the witnesses to the posthumous edict. He had always been taciturn and kept a low profile, making it impossible to see any possibility of him betraying the Orthodoxy. Why? Because I must consider the future of the Orthodoxy, consider the interests of the human race. Taoist Baisher stared into Chen Changsheng's eyes and said, "The Orthodoxy is not the religion of one person, but the gate of millions upon millions of believers. It absolutely cannot be moved by the will of His Holiness alone, unless you are a true saint. Regretfully, although your talent is high, even having the possibility of becoming the youngest true saint in history, you and I both know that the venerable Taoist master will not give you this sort of opportunity. You also know that you will never have this sort of opportunity again. So after 3 years, you could no longer remain silent." Chen Changsheng was quiet for a while, then said, "I thought that many people within the Orthodoxy have been waiting for me to stand up once more. Those people are all idiots." Taoist Baisher did not conceal his disdain as he glanced at Linghai Zhuang. It was obvious that the new faction of the Orthodoxy, led by Linghai Zhuang and Taoist Yuan, had always maintained a rather radical attitude, hoping that Chen Changsheng could rule over the world as Pope as soon as possible. Taoist Baisher continued, "Why did His Holiness choose you as a successor? Because he felt that this martial nephew of yours was very similar to him. And now, when you stand out and begin to rely on the authority of the Pope, your so-called schemes, to attempt to use these methods to obtain victory in this war with the imperial court, you will become less and less like your venerable self. On the contrary, you will become more and more like your master. And if you want to become a person like your master, how can you possibly win against him?" At this point, he turned to Linghai Zhuang and Enlin and shouted, "Have you ever considered this question? Why should the Orthodoxy be consigned to eternal damnation because of his inexplicable desire to go against his master? Since this is the case, why don't we just welcome the venerable Taoist as His Holiness the Pope?" It was quiet outside the church. The trees within the holy gate swayed in the wind, throwing off the last of the white flowers that had bloomed last night. Chen Changsheng's gaze fell on those faintly discernible figures of priests in the distant forest. After a few moments of silence, he said, "You might not understand me very well." Taoist Baisher had not expected to hear this answer. After a few moments of shock, he once more became cold and unyielding. "It doesn't matter. You can remove me from the position of Archbishop right now. even do what you did to Mu Jiushi and cripple my legacy. However, on the day that the venerable Taoist returns to the Li Palace, I will be waiting for you there." And Lin fell silent. Linghai Zhuang said, "I've worked with you for several decades, but I've never realized that you were such a stupid person." Taoist Baisher coldly glanced at him and said, "What sort of crime do you want to accuse me of? Plotting against His Holiness the Pope? Just like in the Mount Song Army headquarters?" Linghai Zhuang replied, "Crimes are not made by others, but committed by oneself." Taoist Baisher impassively said, "Don't forget, this is Wenshui." Wenshui was the territory of the Tang clan. No matter how powerful the orthodoxy was, if it wanted to execute Taoist Baisher on the spot, it would be impossible to hide from the Tang clan's eyes. This also meant that if Chun Changsheng wanted to uphold the dignity of the church's laws, he could only seize Taoist Baisher and even sever his legacy, but he could not execute him on the spot. At this moment, footsteps came from the forest. The Archbishop of Wenshui had arrived in front of the Taoist church, a letter in his hand. The Archbishop lowered his head, not even glancing at the blood-soaked Taoist Baisher, nor did he reveal any strange expression. He was as calm and modest as usual. "Your Holiness, the letter Your Holiness has been waiting for has arrived." Chun Changsheng took the letter and opened it, taking out the paper and reading it over. Linghai Zhuang and Lin looked over, as did Guan Feibai and Zhixiu. Even Taoist Baisher, whose fate was still uncertain, looked over. They all knew that someone had been writing to Chun Changsheng this entire time. From the matter of the Mount Song Army headquarters to the itinerary to Wenshui, it had all been drawn up by the person writing the letter. Everyone was very curious as to who had written the letter. Only Nank was uninterested. She continued to follow Chun Changsheng's orders, standing in front of Taoist Baisher and staring into his eyes. After reading the letter, Chun Changsheng seemed to be thinking about something. After a period of silence, he handed the letter to Linghai Zhuang. Taoist Baisher sneered, pretending to be mysterious. What did that person say in the letter? Could it be that they foresaw this matter in advance? Linghai Zhuang's gaze left the letter and fell on Taoist Baisher's face, his gaze somewhat strange. Taoist Baisher suddenly felt a chill run through his body. Linghai Zhuang said, "You guessed right. That person said that we had to kill you to establish our might." Taoist Baisher paled at these words. He did not know who the person who had written the letter was, but he knew that many of the orthodoxy's affairs had recently come from that person's handwriting. Crucially, through these last few days of observation, he was extremely sure that Chun Changsheng had a deep trust in that person, that he would do whatever he said. At this moment, the figure of a priest appeared in the forest. The Archbishop of Wenshui went forward to inquire. After a few moments, he returned and reported to Chun Changsheng in a low voice, "The Tang's second master has come to pay a visit to His Holiness. Many thanks to everyone for their continued support. I hope that everyone will support the Hall of Glory and the overall selection of works for the 515 Fan Festival this time. In addition, the Fan Festival also has some red packets. Take a look and continue your subscriptions."